Should we start letting people in?
Sure. Let's get the party started, as they would say.
I'll admit them all in.
Thank
You're all
you.
set.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hi there.
Morning.
Good morning.
More people coming in, but I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Bettina Geisfehler. I'm with the Business Network for Offshore Wind, and I have been in contact with all you delegates, and we're really excited to get our virtual portion of our delegation trip kicked off. Together with Scottish Development International, Barry Logue, we've been have a great agenda for you today. If you do have any questions for speakers and presentations, there is a chat function that you can type in your questions, and we'll answer those after each presenter has finished their presentation.
So why don't we give it a minute or so? I see many of the delegates are in, and we have our first speaker to join us in a second. So just to reiterate, my name is Barry Logue. I'm with Scottish Development International. We are the group that works in foreign markets to assist Scottish companies bringing their expertise into market, particularly with offshore wind. We will be recording the session as mentioned, and we will be sharing this amongst certain interested parties that weren't able to be here. So we would ask that, anything that would be commercially sensitive or such, if you don't want to share it with a broader audience, please refrain and speak to us directly. Bettina, if there's anything else, if not, I think perhaps we should turn it over to Drew and get ourselves going.
Yes.
So welcome everybody, and thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Our first speaker is Drew Milne from Marine Scotland.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm getting a message that I can't share my screen while somebody else is. Thanks. Cheers. There we go. Can you all see the screen now?
It is up.
Perfect. That's great. Thanks very much. Hi, thanks very much for inviting me to join you today. I've been asked to do a little presentation on sort of Marine Scotland and our sectoral marine planning process for offshore wind. So just a little bit of background before I go further. I can't go further at all because my presentation is not moving. There we go. So my name is Drew Milne. I'm a marine planning and assessment specialist with Marine Scotland. I lead our sectoral marine planning process, which is the system we use to identify areas for future development of offshore wind in Scottish waters. But Marine Scotland more generally is a full directorate of the Scottish Government. We sometimes get referred to as an agency. Doesn't really bother me, but some people are quite pedantic about it. We are a full part of the Scottish Government, and we have responsibility for the sustainable management of Scotland's seas. I'll talk more about the planning aspect in a few minutes, but that also includes regulation of all marine licensable activities, including offshore wind and marine renewables. And unlike some of the other divisions within Scottish Government, we also have a dedicated science team. There's about 200 members of staff up in our lab in Aberdeen, sort of on our east coast, and they're looking at a wide range of scientific information and evidence that helps support our policy development and our planning work. So we have responsibility for planning out to 200 nautical miles under various legislation, what I'll not go into here, but that does include offshore wind and marine renewables. More generally, we have a national marine plan which was adopted in 2015. That sets out the larger policy framework for all activities in Scottish waters. It was one of the first national marine plans in Europe, and has now been through 2 revisions just over the last few years, with the last one actually just being in March 2021. That set out that a lot of our policy and frameworks are still effective, but with so much changing in the marine environment and things getting so much busier, blue economy development, offshore wind increasing, it's probably time to start thinking about a revision, but we've not made any confirmed plans about how that's going to move. In addition, we also have 11 Scottish marine regions, and each of those is in one way or another working towards development of its own regional marine plan. Right now, we've got 3 areas progressing quite quickly, and the other ones are under review as we move forward. I'll talk more about the sectoral planning process in detail in the next couple of slides, but that's the tool we use to identify areas in Scottish marine environment that we will then take forward for assessment and then possibly for future offshore wind leasing. In addition to the assessment process and planning process that we've been through for Scotland that you're probably all aware of, we're also developing new processes now for innovation and targeted oil and gas development, which is looking at using offshore wind to electrify oil and gas installations and decarbonize those in Scottish waters. And we're also working on one of the sort of bigger areas in relating to the use of offshore wind and energy in Scotland and across the UK is grid. So how we bring that power back to shore, and we're working across Scotland and UK governments to review the transmission network and allow for the capacity that we are able to generate with our resources in Scotland to get back into the system to demand. I'm right at the end of the presentation. I'd like to cover a little bit on ScotMer, which is our research program and feeds very much into our planning process and helps us answer the questions that we raise throughout the planning and consenting processes in Scotland. My colleague Lorna is speaking a little bit later about offshore wind policy and ambitions. So I'll not dwell too much on this, but just to set out a bit of background for what we're doing in Scotland, we have our own offshore wind policy statement with an aim for 11 gigawatts by 2030. And we also have a very aggressive net zero commitment to reach net zero by 2045, which is 5 years ahead of the wider UK. And then in the more general policy context, we're looking at a UK commitment of 40 gigawatts by 2040 and initial ambitions of 1 gigawatt of floating by 2030. But talk a bit more about that in the context of Scotland. We would like to see obviously a lot more in a Scottish environment. Currently, we have around 1 gigawatts of operational capacity. My map, I'm afraid, is a little bit out of date. Some of the planned areas are now into construction, and some are in operation up here in the Moray Firth. And we have about 7 gigawatts either consented or in the process of construction, and then at least another 4.2 gigawatts in sort of early planning stages, sort of at the very early scoping area. Within our system just now. And Gayle will talk a little bit more about that in the next presentation, I think. So how do we do sectoral marine planning or offshore wind planning in Scotland? Our National Marine Plan sets out a policy that all offshore wind and marine renewable developments will be located in areas identified by our sectoral marine planning process. And that horrendous diagram on the right there is our sectoral marine planning process. I'll not go through every step in there, obviously, but what I'd like to emphasize in this process or in this presentation is the role of engagement in bringing people along and ensuring that your plan can proceed without too many surprises or too many unexpected events that derail the process. Our process starts with a lot of early and continuous engagement. We begin up in the area, this area here at the top right, hopefully you can see my mouse, the blue scoping area, with what we call an opportunity and constraint analysis, which brings a lot of the available spatial and environmental information together. And we rely very much on the experts and local sea users to help us gather that information and bring it together. We then construct a model and identify new areas. of interest in our environment, but we take that through several stages of consultation and further engagement before we get to anything even close to a draft plan. So following that sort of scoping work, we would look to engage formally with the public on the areas that have been identified. And then once we've agreed on a set spatial capacity or spatial footprint, we would then take that through a much more detailed sustainability appraisal. In the UK and Scotland, that includes strategic environmental assessments, habitats regulations appraisals. So the strategic environmental assessment is a wide-ranging environmental assessment looking at a range of impacts. The habitats regulations appraisal is much more focused on our designated protected sites and testing adverse effect on site integrity. So are we going to damage any of the protected sites that are already in existence with the plan or projects that come later? And additionally, we carry out a social and economic impact assessment, which tests the impact of the plan across social and economic receptors. That full sustainability appraisal and the draft plan that comes as a result is consulted upon under a statutory consultation, and all of that information is used to help construct a final plan that we then put up to Scottish ministers for adoption. One of the challenges of doing things in this way and identifying a planning process and doing all that without being developers yourself is that you have to work with a lot of assumptions. So we have introduced an iterative plan review process to the plan framework. So at the end of the plan, once it's adopted, we've committed to keeping the plan under review and updating it as necessary and regularly if required. And something I'll talk about on another slide is that there's obviously a bit of a discrepancy between what we assessed and what we've got out of Scotland. And so we're trying to deal with that process just now. One of the other things we do as we go along this process is to deliver something called regional locational guidance. That is a super large document of all the spatial and environmental evidence that we've used to construct our assessments and to carry out our sustainability appraisal. And that's published and all available online for other stakeholders, but particularly for developers as they progress project ideas, and it can help them in preparing assessments or applications. Excuse me. So what does that look like in practice? I'm sorry, there's a lot of text up to now, so I get to show you some maps. Right back at our scoping stage, we identify these areas of search. This is the result of our opportunity and constraint analysis. And it very much identifies areas where we wouldn't be looking to develop, and then areas where we think there are possibilities. We engage with our stakeholders quite heavily at this stage through a series of workshops to refine those areas down into what we called our scoping areas of search. So that took those large blue areas and transferred them into 24 smaller bespoke areas that we thought had potential, but we wanted to find out more information and gather more evidence or stakeholder views on these areas. So that goes out for a public consultation to collect views and new information. One of the interesting parts about this process, or I certainly find, is that we're developing from a plan from a very environmental and marine management point of view, as opposed to being developers ourselves and technical specialists. So one of the questions we asked during that scoping consultation is have we got it right? Where would you like to see development? What are the thoughts on our process? So one of the inputs we got through that consultation was this sort of heat map of developer suggestions. And you can see here that we got some of it quite right, some of it a little bit off. And there were some areas that came forward from that consultation process that we then took away and looked at again, but ultimately decided were not suitable for progressing. Ultimately, that evolved into a draft plan, which we consulted on and took forward. Took more formally through the sustainability appraisal, and then took forward for the full consultation later in the process. Excuse me. So that whole process to get to there took about 1.5 years of engagement and assessment work, and resulted then in a 12-week, actually 14-week consultation as we ran over the Christmas period. Before we could then go back to Scottish ministers with a consultation analysis and a recommendation on how to proceed. I want to just jump back to the point about engagement, though, and involvement in the process going through, as I think it's really important to emphasize that whilst you'll see in the final map that there were some minor tweaks and changes to the plan from the draft plan to the final stage, there was nothing major and surprising that we got out of the consultation and feedback. And I think that is largely due to the engagement we undertook throughout the planning process. I know you've got Malcolm Morrison speaking later on today. I don't know if he's in just now. I'm sure Malcolm will agree that we probably didn't get everything right, particularly around the fisheries consultation, but we did a good job of trying to keep everybody in the loop and having reasonably open conversations. We managed that in the planning process through delivery of, setting up, of two cross-sectoral steering groups. So they represented environmental interests and socioeconomic interests, and they fed into all of our screening and scoping work, all of our methodologies for our assessment work, and then obviously we're involved in the consultation stages as we went forward, so the scoping and draft plan consultation. And we also took the time to target our consultation events to specific interests or issues that we'd identified through those processes. So you can see there a map of our north region in the planning process. We obviously identified areas for consultation near and in the vicinity of these locations, but we also looked at the data, particularly around fishing interest, to find where people were fishing from and where they were returning to in ports, in order to ensure that we were capturing opportunities, at least, to speak to people at their sort of home area, not just expecting it to be just the local community in the vicinity of the N2 option that you can see on your screen. Obviously, people might be fishing there from around the country. What that resulted in, I'm glad to say, is the ScotWind, the sectoral marine plan for offshore wind energy, and then the ScotWind leasing round. So on the left, you can see the plan options that we identified and were adopted by Scottish ministers in 2020. There was 15 plan options there, and we assessed a potential in capacity of 10 gigawatts. Well, so that meant we had anticipated a national level, we anticipated a national total capacity of 10 gigawatts across those 15 plan options, and that's what we assessed and consulted upon. Obviously, you'll have seen the news that the ScotWind leasing arrangement has led to a much more significant stated ambition for development in the Scottish waters, with up to 25 gigawatts covering 17 projects in Scottish waters. That leads to some issues. It's also obviously a great opportunity for Scotland to progress offshore wind, meet our net zero targets, and start to build a supply chain. But it means that some of our assumptions are a little bit out of date or out of context now, and we need to do a little bit of work to pick up that process. Excuse me. So yeah, I just wanted to finish with one last slide talking about our iterative plan review process. Noting that discrepancy between the 10 gigawatts and the 25 gigawatts and all the other information and evidence that has come forward since we adopted the plan. We've done new scientific studies, we've participated in new research. It's allowed us to progress the iterative plan review process to look at all that extra information and determine whether we need to, we're in the process of determining whether we need to make any changes or make any new change any of our assumptions. So if we look back at the planning process that we carried out, we tested this 10 gigawatts in a range of scenarios in a range of locations around Scotland. So I think we're able to say with some confidence that our individual assumptions for each of the plan options are probably within scope, but cumulatively we've got quite a lot of work to do in terms of determining exactly what the potential impact may be. I also mentioned that we're running the INTOG process, and so we're going to take the opportunity in Scotland to combine the assessment processes for both of those planning tasks. So essentially assessing INTOG alongside the new information of ScotWind to get a more holistic and collective view of what is actually happening in the offshore wind world, the offshore wind world in Scotland. And so we're now undertaking a compatibility assessment, and then we're going to lead through to combining our full assessment work later in the year once we know what's come out of the INTOG process. And that just leads me to mention Scottish Marine Energy Research, which is our ScotMer research program. That really is the driving force now of the iterative plan review process. This is our collective research group. It's managed by Marine Scotland and our science colleagues, but it involves academics and experts across a range of receptors. And they're helping to develop research proposals and identify knowledge gaps and questions that we need to answer in order to help our planning process and consenting work going forward. And that really is the focus now, is about trying to answer some of these questions and move our planning framework forward, so that in the event that we take forward any new planning, or at the very least so that we can influence or help determine the INTOG and ScotWind reassessment process with the most up-to-date and useful information. I'm afraid I've nipped through all of that very quickly, so I'm happy to take questions, or I'm not sure if we've done that right at the end, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Drew. If anyone has any questions for Drew, please just go ahead and speak or put it in the chat.
And just a thing, there should be the raise the hand facility. So if you want to just raise your hand, we can recognize you and have you come in. But please feel free to ask questions of Drew. There's a lot of information there that he'd be happy to expand on.
Stephanie?
Hi, everyone. It's Stephanie Watson from the Maine Governor's Energy Office here. And thank you very much for the presentations and for this whole opportunity. This is incredibly helpful for us. One of the things I wanted to ask about is a comment that you made about potentially some of the consent with the fisheries could have been improved and that there was additional work there. I was wondering if there's any additional information on that you could share with us, as we are in the Gulf of Maine and in Maine waters are very concerned about making sure that we are working effectively with our fishing community. It's super important to our economy, and appreciate any insights you have.
Of course, yeah, and I would emphasize that I think you've got a really good opportunity with Malcolm later on to get it direct from the sector themselves. Certainly in our planning work for the sectoral marine plan, there were a lot of questions raised about the use of data and what it represented, and whether we had the most up-to-date versions, or could do more with the fishing sector's data themselves, so such as plotter machines and you know, not anecdotal, but the evidence that they held that isn't held in sort of larger governmental or regulatory processes. So I really would encourage you to consider that information and at least hear the arguments for and against that information. Some of it's very difficult to use and integrate with other systems, but there are opportunities and possibilities for looking at other information, and I guess really my emphasis is engagement as early as you can with the sector. I think that our planning process is reasonably well received by a number of sectors in Scotland, particularly because you get to see the areas before you find out what a project might be. You know that these areas are going to be progressing, as opposed to a leasing process that is a very wide area of interest, and then suddenly projects appear out of the blue. That really catches a lot of people off guard, and I think sets people back a little bit. But yeah, happy to be in contact, you know, separately if you'd like to follow up with more information or examples.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
We also have a hand raised by Max.
Thank you. And Sarah, great question. I was going to ask a very similar one, but I'll switch to my second question because you did touch on the fishers. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about how the environmental working groups played out, and the best way to engage environmental stakeholders, particularly early on in your development process when impact data is, you know, lacking in as much as there hadn't been experience in those locations with offshore wind development, and how, in the absence of that data, how the environmental working group was comfortable proceeding, and what different measures for kind of management going forward were adopted to assuage any of the concerns, kind of in the absence of knowing what exactly will happen to those different kind of environmental stakeholders and constituencies.
Sure, yeah. I'll caveat that I don't think we've assured every concern that we've raised. We set up the cross-sectoral steering groups very early on, and they included representation from our statutory environmental consultation bodies, but also a range of other interests that are obviously related to the potential impacts, such as RSPB, which is the Royal Society for Protection of Birds across the year, excuse me, and then interests around marine mammals and other stakeholders. So it wasn't just our statutory bodies that were involved. You're absolutely right. Some of these areas were new areas. We very much put forward data suggestions and information that we knew would be available, but we sought their input as much as possible in determining new information or taking things forward. One of the key considerations for us, and in terms of ensuring that people were content with the way things went forward, was keeping their involvement in the methodologies that were going to be used to carry out the assessments, and then particularly in agreeing the assumptions that we were going to use to take forward the assessments. So where there was information lacking, we reached agreements about how we would estimate or present risks or impact in a context. So we agreed scenarios, development scenarios of 3, 5, and 10 gigawatts. We agreed where they could be located within the options. For instance, with the fishing sector, we adopted an approach of not considering any displacement or any continued fishing activity within an area. So we just said, look, when we do our methodology and our assessment of those impacts, we're going to say it's a complete cessation of activity. And that allowed people to go along with the assessment process where there were gaps in knowledge and information. I think that was really important. It is also what has led to a little bit of concern now that we've got a larger potential capacity out of the Scotland process than what we had in terms of the assessments. But that commitment to iterative plan review process and keeping those things up to date should allow us to amend those discrepancies. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No problem.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Drew. Oh, I see one more hand raised. Fred, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Fred Fellman with the Port of Seattle Commission. It was that last statement that caught my attention, was you go through the assessment and then you end up with a larger area than you started. So I would imagine that got some of the constituents concerned by the process.
So I think it's one of the sort of intricacies of the system over here is that what we have right now are options. They're not leases. They're not guaranteed projects or anything like that. So what we've identified in the plan were areas that could be taken forward under a certain set of conditions. All of those conditions have been met through the planning and the leasing round that took place. But what we'll end up with in a couple of weeks, I guess, is a series of option agreements that then have to go through our full consenting and testing process. So in addition to the assessment work we'll do at the strategic level, there's also going to be quite rigorous consenting tests for each of these projects at the individual level. So it's just by having that space on the map doesn't guarantee you a consent or a lease now. There's still a lot of steps to go through. So I think that process is well established. In fact, Gayle's about to describe it to you. So hopefully that will alleviate any outstanding concerns while we work through our compatibility assessments.
I appreciate that. I was really just thinking sort of like the perception from the constituents while the assessment continues and gets refined. Keeping the folks at the table is always one of the challenges. And
definitely,
so,
yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Great. Our next speaker is Gayle Holland from Marine Scotland.
Hi, just checking. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
You might want to just speak up just a bit or move a little closer to the mic. It was a little soft there
I'll come
for
a
me.
bit closer. I'll come a bit closer to my mic. Thanks. So yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you today on offshore renewables consenting in Scotland. So my name's Gayle Holland, and I head up the consenting section at Marine Scotland Licensing Operations team. I've been in the team for about 12 years now, so pretty much from the start of offshore wind in Scotland. And prior to that, I've got a background in marine ecology. Next slide, please. So this is just a bit of an overview of what I'll talk about today. So give a brief introduction to the role of MS Lot, and then also look at the kind of current picture of what we've done in terms of consenting to date. And then looking at kind of some of the key stages in terms of pre-application, engagement and survey requirements, and also looking at the role of Marine Scotland science, and then also post-consent. So as a bit of an introduction, MS Lot processes application, sorry, next slide, onto the introduction slide. An introduction, MS Lot processes applications for all marine renewable energy developments in Scotland out to 200 nautical miles. These developments require Section 36 consent under the Electricity Act 1989, and Scottish ministers make these decisions on the Section 36 applications. These decisions are informed by a recommendation from MS Lot, so that's the role that MS Lot play. Marine licences are also required for these developments, and these are issued by MS Lot on behalf of Scottish ministers, either under the Marine Scotland Act for projects within 12 nautical miles, or the Marine and Coastal Access Act for projects outside 12 nautical miles. For any associated onshore works, there is the option of deemed planning under the Electricity Act, which is determined by Scottish ministers, and that would be done at the same time as the decision on the Section 36 consent. Or there's the option for planning permission under the Town and Country Planning Act, and that would be determined by the relevant local authority. For noisy activities, there's the requirement for European protected species licenses, and particularly for cetaceans, and also for basking shark licenses. These licenses are also issued by MS Lot. And then in terms of post-consent, we also play quite a big role there. There's the issue of safety zones during construction, and also the agreement of decommissioning programmes by Scottish ministers. Next slide, please. So the map on the right, I think Drew also used this. It's quite a good demonstration of the picture in Scotland at the moment. So the map shows offshore wind projects which are in planning, consented, under construction and operational in the kind of orange and red tones, and then the blue areas of the new ScotWind sites. And then you'll see from the table on the left that there's very little in terms of wave and tide. So the focus is really on offshore wind in Scotland at the moment. In terms of floating offshore wind, there's currently 77 megawatts operational at 2 individual sites on the east coast. And then you'll have heard from Drew in relation to ScotWind and INTOG. There's a huge increase in scale with the Scotland leasing round, with 17 new projects and up to 25 gigawatts of offshore wind. Of the 17 projects, 10 are for floating offshore wind, 6 are for fixed, and 1 site is proposing a mixture of fixed and floating. And also in addition to ScotWind, we have the INTOG leasing round for 4 gigawatts and for the decarbonisation of oil and gas, and also 0.5 gigawatts for innovation projects. So you can see we really are ramping up the scale in terms of what's already been done over the last 10 years to what we're hoping to achieve over the next 10 years. Next slide, please. Yeah, so pre-application is a really critical phase of the project with 2 key areas of activity in relation to consenting. So firstly, carrying out surveys and collecting all the environmental data, and secondly, engagement with key stakeholders. For surveys, we require 2 years of digital aerial surveys for birds, and there may be a requirement for passive acoustic monitoring for cetaceans, where there's likely to be noisy activities or reported areas for cetaceans. There'll be a requirement for benthic surveys to identify key benthic features, and there may be a requirement for fish surveys, in particular, if an area is important nursery ground or spawning ground. Traditionally, fish surveys were done using trawls, but new approaches looking at eDNA has been considered, where sediment samples are collected and analysed for fish DNA. And although this can't be used to quantify fish abundance, it is a good indicator of species presence. Fisheries data is important, with various data sets being looked at, and also engagement with local fisheries to try and validate these data sets. And then there's ongoing geophysical and geotechnical surveys at pre-application to help inform project design. In terms of engagement, we really encourage engagement early on in the process with key stakeholders, including statutory nature conservation bodies, environmental non-government organisations, local authorities, especially in terms of socioeconomic impacts and possible visual impact, and also in relation to any onshore works. It's important to talk to the fishing industry to help inform fisheries baseline data, and for example, informing things like cable routes. And then also important to engage with navigation and aviation authorities. We do find that if issues can be discussed with stakeholders pre-application, and then sufficient mitigation discussed and included in an application, then this can really help with a smoother consenting path. And of course, we mustn't forget local communities. It's really important to keep them informed of plans and projects. There is a requirement for a formal pre-application consultation with local communities, including holding public events and submitting a pre-application consultation report prior to application. Next slide, please. So this slide's about environmental legislation, and although I understand that you'll be working with different environmental legislation, I wanted to discuss this as it really drives the whole process. There's 2 key pieces of environmental legislation: environmental impact assessment and the habitats regulations. They're both derived from EU directives, but following EU exit, the domestic legislation which transposed the directives remains in place. So for EIA, for environmental impact assessment, the key stages are really scoping. This defines the scope of the assessment, both in terms of receptors and impact pathways, which must be assessed, but also makes very clear the assessment methodologies which are expected. And the EIA regulations require that the EIA report must be based on that scoping opinion. So it's really important that we get that scoping advice correct. The scoping exercise takes approximately 4 months. The application itself is accompanied by an EIA report, and determination target is approximately 9 months, although it's recognised that this is the best case scenario for a high quality application. For projects in more sensitive areas, the determination period is likely to be longer. And then following determination, if a project's granted consent, there's also a lot of work to do post-consent, which I'll discuss further in a minute. And during the determination phase, the developer continues to engage with stakeholders to close down issues and produces a gap analysis to record how concerns raised will be addressed. And then this gap analysis is used by MS Lot to help inform conditions which would be attached to any consent. In terms of the habitats regulations, these regulations concern European protected sites and the steps that need to be taken before consent can be granted. So if a project is likely to have an effect on a European site, then we're required to complete an appropriate assessment and can only grant consent if a conclusion of no adverse effect on the integrity of the site can be reached, unless the derogation provisions within the regulations are engaged. The derogation provisions require that there are no alternative solutions to reaching the same policy objective, and that there are imperative reasons of overriding public interest which require the project to go ahead. They also require that compensatory measures are put in place to compensate for any negative impacts. So although these requirements are specific to our own regulations, you may have similar considerations in terms of demonstrating sustainable development by ensuring that negative impacts are addressed. Next slide, please. So looking briefly at some of the key challenges which we've come across, cumulative assessment and ensuring a consistent approach to assessment. Marine Scotland are currently leading a project to develop a cumulative effects framework, which brings together all the data on all the UK wind farms and all the individual assessment tools. This will then ensure a consistent and transparent approach to cumulative impact assessment. The delivery for this project is expected to be June this year, and we see it as a really key tool, especially with the scale of Scotland. There's also the design envelope, so we try and encourage that when applications come in, the design envelope is as narrow as possible. Otherwise, this results in additional precaution in the advice provided and additional mitigation. There's challenges for fisheries interactions. Engagement can sometimes be challenging due to the potential for conflict and the overlap of wind farm areas with traditional fishing areas. There's challenges with aviation and navigation, especially with the increase in size of turbines and the volume of potential infrastructure. Overlapping infrastructure is becoming an increasing problem. The sea is becoming a busy place, and we have instances of cable routes for one wind farm going through the site of another wind farm, or overlapping landfall areas, or overlap with other industries, such as cable routes overlapping with pipelines. These kinds of scenarios can cause some issues during consenting. New technology such as floating wind and development in new areas that we don't know so much about can also cause challenges. And also new processes, the derogations processes under the habitats regulations, which I mentioned in the previous slide. We haven't done this before and it's new to us, so therefore it's likely to be challenging. Next slide, please. I just wanted to talk briefly about the role of Marine Scotland Science. So they sit in the same directorate as MS Lot and provide us with specialist advice on a range of receptors. So these are listed on the left-hand side of the slide. So they're able to advise us where perhaps there's conflicting advice from consultees, or where a particular stakeholder comes with advice that we're not too sure about in terms of maybe commercial fisheries. So we're able to go to Marine Scotland Science and ask for their expert opinion on all these various receptors, which is really a valuable resource. The Marine Analytical Unit provides a similar role, but in terms of socio-economic impact assessment. And another key role of MSS is the research, again, which Drew mentioned in the previous presentation. So the ScotMER programme, the Scottish Marine Energy Research Programme, identifies key evidence gaps in which we feel have a real impact on consenting decisions. So each of the receptors on the left-hand side has its own evidence map, and then these maps are prioritised so that we understand what the kind of key priorities are in terms of really focusing the research to address the most important problems. And then we can kind of put in place funding to address these issues. So it's a really useful resource to us. There's a few of the current projects listed there underneath. There's a lot, so there's far too many to talk about, but a particularly interesting one is the bottom one there, Prepared project. It's a new project and the first of its kind in the UK, and it's looking at the ecosystem effects of offshore wind farms. So looking at what the prey species do around offshore wind farms. Are they acting as fish aggregation devices and attracting prey? And what then does that do to the predator populations, the birds and the marine mammals? So this is a 5-year project which will kind of look at how that interaction plays out, and I think will really help our understanding of what happens in operational wind farms. Next slide, please. So going on to post-consent, if consent is granted for a project, then there are normally a number of conditions to be discharged. Most of these are in the forms of plans, which provide the detail of what was considered within the application. So for example, things like design layout plans, cable plans, construction method statements, piling strategies, monitoring programs. And these plans must reflect what was in the application, but they do provide the extra detail. So we agree all these plans to make sure that we're content that they have the kind of relevant information within them. There's also applications which I mentioned earlier for safety zones, so that we can keep other vessels away from the construction activities. And decommissioning programs are to be agreed to ensure that infrastructure will be removed at the end of the operational life of the wind farm, and that financial securities are in place to allow this. There's activities such as unexploded ordnance clearance, which require additional marine licenses and European protected species licenses. And there's a lot of research going on in this area at the moment to try and find less noisy ways of doing this. There's more detailed geophysical and geotechnical work to inform the siting of turbines and the cable routes. And there's also monitoring requirements and reporting on that monitoring, both pre-construction, during construction, and during operation. Within Scotland, we have a couple of regional advisory groups set up to help kind of direct and inform on the monitoring. So these groups are regional, as I say, so there's one in the Moray Firth area of Scotland, and there's one in the Forth and Tay region. And these groups advise on appropriate monitoring and really encourage collaboration between developers so we can get the most out of our monitoring. And they've proved to be really, really successful over the last few years in terms of things like developers getting together to arrange their maybe aerial surveys pre-construction and during operation so that larger areas can be covered. And there's all kinds of really interesting collaboration going on to improve the monitoring outputs. Next slide, please. So this slide just includes, I'm assuming these slides will be shared amongst the delegates, so it includes a few links to some of our web pages and guidance. The top link there is to our licensing and consenting manual. It's currently being revised, but the current version is actually on the website, so it's still accessible. And there's a link to our project web pages. So this page includes links to all our offshore wind farms. It's got all the environmental information, all the kind of consultation responses, all the decision notices, all the assessments that are completed to inform the decisions. The third link there is to the regional advisory groups and includes information on things like terms of reference of these groups and outputs of the monitoring reports. And then the next link is to some general marine licensing guidance, followed by some decommissioning guidance. Again, that's in draft form, but the final form should be published later in the summer. And then the last link there is to our ScotMer research programme. So it includes links to all the different receptor groups and all the evidence maps and all the kind of reports that come out of all the research that's ongoing. So hopefully these will be useful to you. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Gayle. I do see we have one question from Drew Carey. He's asking if SEPA have a role in offshore wind at present.
They don't have a very big role. So SEPA are the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and they really only have a remit out to 3 nautical miles. So they're much more kind of on land and close to shore focused in their remit. They are listed as a statutory consultee under the regulations so that we do consult them, and they sometimes respond, but generally not that often. They come back with some maybe standing advice, and it really is the kind of shoreline area that they're concerned about more than the kind of offshore wind farm itself.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please just raise your hand. Yes, Stephanie?
Hi, thanks, Gail. That was really helpful. I had seen in some of the Scottish permit documents for High Wind and Kincardine that there were some fisheries specific permitting conditions put in there. And I was just wondering, how does that happen within this process? Like, where does that take place? Where, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, for example, can provide input to the process, and how does that input get evaluated and incorporated into an enforceable permit condition?
So we consult with the Scottish Fishermen's Federation and other fisheries bodies at the scoping stage of the process. So that's where you're trying to inform the assessment. So at that stage, they can feed back to advise on what aspects of impact pathways they would like to see considered and any methodologies used. They can feed in data. So that's the kind of first stage where they are consulted officially by us. And then within that advice, we issue a scoping opinion, which will include the requests from the likes of the SFF in terms of assessment methodologies and data to be used, so that when they do the assessment itself, it must be based on that scoping opinion. So it must include that information. And then the assessment itself, again, the fisheries bodies will get consulted on that and will provide a consultation response back to us. These responses may request certain conditions are included in any consent. A few of the kind of key ones that we tend to ask for are things like the requirement for over trawl surveys for cable routes to make sure that they can still fish over the cables. So we will consider what the fisheries bodies ask for and see whether it's appropriate to include any of these as conditions of the consent. So that's kind of how they feed into the process itself. I mean, there's within all the wind farms, out with the construction period, the fishermen are permitted into the wind farm areas to fish. It is more difficult within the floating wind farms like High Wind and Kincardine because of the infrastructure and the cables, so that it's not considered to be as good in terms of multi-use with fisheries as the fixed foundations.
So if I could follow up on that, then the fishermen around those floating projects are not permitted to fish within the arrays. Is that correct?
So there's nothing in the consent which stops them. So there's no ban on fishing or anything like that, but it is seen as more risky, so that they tend to stay out of the areas just because there's the very wide cabling that stretches for big distances. They don't feel, I think the fishery industry don't feel that it's safe for them to fish within the floating wind farm areas. But again, it's something that you can ask from Malcolm Morrison later on as well, and he's speaking to you their thoughts on that.
Okay, great. I appreciate it. And are any of those fishermen asking for compensation at all for that space they're not fishing?
Yes. So there are various groups set up to help facilitate discussion between the fishing industry and offshore wind farm developers. So we've set up things like commercial fishing working groups, which has that opportunity to discuss all kinds of things. But in relation to compensation itself, we know there's two individual fishermen, but we keep very much out of these discussions. We feel that that's an issue for the developers to sort out with the fishermen and come to an agreement. So we don't get involved in saying you must pay this much or whatever. It's left up to them to agree.
Great, thank you.
Great. Next up, we have Isla Robb with EC20.
Sorry, Bettina, could I just ask a follow-up question to Gayle? This is Peter Lyon from NYSERDA. If it's beholden upon the developer to come to any type of compensation package, are they generally in tune with that, or do they push back against it in those conversations? What direction does that seem like it's going in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a mixture. There is kind of guidance out there on how, how these agreements can be reached and things like that. So yeah, it's a little bit of, there's a lot of negotiation goes on, I think, because I think there's, yes, it's the flow guidance which is out there, which kind of suggests how compensation should be agreed. I can try and provide a link for that in the chat as well, if that's helpful, so that you can have a look at that. Yes, there is guidance out there, and it tends to be negotiation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Any
Yeah.
more questions?
I just to follow up on Peter's thing. So this is Barry Logue. The current status in the U.S. is, and I think Malcolm will speak to it. There is a RODA, the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, has proposed, that the federal government, again, BOEM and perhaps National Wildlife, step in with a more overarching impact mitigation scheme. I think within Scotland, given the discrete nature of the fisheries and the development areas that are being called out upon, is similar to the way we do the onshore, where the local community that's going to be most impacted by, say the export landing cable, that the developer and those communities have in the past worked out some type of community impact fund, trust, or other, I guess, structure. And I believe the same is given the nature of the fishing areas that are impacted, that those groups work out an arrangement amongst themselves without it becoming a legislated solution. I think in the US, that is going about it in a different fashion. And again, the number of the hate to say it, the footprint of the fishing communities that we're talking about range, just on the East Coast from Maine to North Carolina, and there's a lot of different fishing organizations that are involved. So it's hard for I think at this time, while there is an interest in having a overarching solution, I think Scotland's approach to it, which is more discreet and actually puts the two parties most impacted, the developer and the actual fishing organizations, in direct communication, may be an approach that might be more effective. But I think there is two different approaches going on here in the U.S. and in Scotland, and I think Malcolm will address some of that later on.
Thank you, Barry. Next, we have Isla Robb with EC20. Isla.
Sorry, I'm just faffing around a wee bit trying to get my video to start sharing. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I shall just move my wee bit of screen over. There we go. Okay, I'm presuming you'll tell me if you can't see my screen, but hopefully you can see it now. Okay, so I am going to talk to you a little bit about all things offshore wind, the supply chain, government perspective and industry perspective. And why am I doing that? How can I do that? I now run a company called EC20 Limited, and that involves working with supply chain companies of all shapes and sizes, from developers and tier ones, so helping them with how they engage with the supply chain, writing supply chain plans and supply chain development statements. We're also working with companies of all shapes and sizes looking to get into offshore wind more, or oil and gas companies or others that haven't even looked at it and are just starting to look at where are the opportunities for them. But previously, before running and owning that business, I worked for Scottish Enterprise, so the public sector, and I led all things offshore wind there. And that involved, again, working or speaking to developers and tier ones about their requirements for offshore wind and the local content and the supply chain, and working with the Scottish government and the UK government to look at how can we maximize the opportunity for local content and what's the most that we can push the developers to do and the tier ones to do. So that's why I've got a perspective from both sides. So just briefly, my company's EC20, and we're all about supply chain and offshore wind. So we all know the opportunity in offshore wind is massive globally. As I've put on the slide here, the gigawatts, but talking about gigawatts is a wee bit difficult to understand what does that actually mean in scale and size. So when we're talking about 53,000 turbines and over 170 substations alone. So that's a global market. It's going to be huge. As you can see, it's going to start hockey sticking up. We're just playing at it at the moment, but it's going to be massive. So everybody is going to be competing for the supply chain. And that is why we need to encourage and support companies to expand their current offering and look at offshore wind as a potential market. This also will mean economic benefits stay in the country as much as possible, rather than always going to developers, always going to their tried and tested suppliers. You need your in-country supply chain to step up and really grasp this opportunity. So we spoke about it globally, and just going back to the UK, again, we may have started early, but we have got much to do as well. There is a huge supply chain, a huge pipeline of projects coming in the UK, and specifically in Scotland. So I'm not sure if anybody's gone over these slides with you earlier this morning or will later, so I'll just briefly touch on it. So we do have ScotWind, which is out, and that's this slide shows you the ScotWind projects, but also our existing projects. So ScotWind's just under 25 gigawatts of projects that will look to be built over the next 10 years. So that's a huge market. What we have coming up later this year, later in the next few months, is what we're calling clearing. And that's the sites from ScotWind which haven't been maximised. So unsuccessful developers can look to take those sites. There's not that many, but there's a large one up here, and then there's a few that the sites weren't maximised. So there are some spare space available, and that could be up to, I think it's a further 5 gigawatts. And then the one in the middle is INTOG, and that's for innovative projects or projects that are looking to power oil and gas platforms. So that's even more opportunity for the supply chain, and that could be up to a further 4 gigawatts of projects. And that's just our little country. So there's huge opportunities for our own supply chain that will be potentially competing with others globally. So what does the supply chain need to know? And this is, in Scotland, we've been supporting the supply chain for a number of years now. And if I'm honest, when we first went out to the supply chain, maybe 10 years ago, we were telling them, offshore wind's coming, it's going to be massive. You, me, and my granny, we're all going to be working in it. Come on, oil and gas companies, over you come to offshore wind. And it just wasn't there yet. So they all thought, all right, this is great. You've rallied the troops. This is great. And it just wasn't there. And that kind of turned a lot of them off. So when you're telling the supply chain about the opportunities, you have to make sure they know and you're realistic about when the opportunities are coming. Now we've got ScotWind. We have a lot of oil and gas companies that are looking for the first time going, right, so the opportunities are here and they're massive and they're now. It's definitely worth looking at. And actually the timing is fantastic as well, because we've had COP, the energy transition, everybody wants to decarbonize. So it is the perfect storm. So there are lots of supply chain companies still in the UK which are looking at offshore wind for the first time. And I'm sure you'll have the same in the US, lots of companies. But they're needing to know a bit more about, well, where are these opportunities? When are they coming? Who are they actually with? Everybody wants to speak to the developers, but how many tenders and contracts do the developers actually give out? And how does the company know if they will be competitive? And how do they become a supplier? So what we did in Scotland and the UK is we offered a variety of support mechanisms to supply chain companies, from very light touch expert support, a couple of days to help the companies understand what they could do and where they could do it. Did they have competitors and customers in the offshore wind sector? And a lot of companies just need that little bit of hand holding. But actually, some need it much more than that. Some need a support with investment. But it is best if supply chain companies do realize what their current capabilities and capacities are and play to their strengths. Just try a slight diversion over or expand your existing market rather than a whole change of you currently make pencils. Now you're going to make televisions. Well, okay, neither of them in the offshore wind sector, but you get my meaning. You need to go from pen to pencil rather than pen to shoes. And also, and I spoke about it before, the timescale. Now I've got another slide that will give you a bit more about timescales. But it is that when are the opportunities coming for you, and where in the project life cycle will the opportunities fit for that company? And there's skills, again, I'll mention that earlier on, but does your company have the existing skill set? Do you need to retrain some of your staff? Should you be partnering with others? How much will you need to invest? Do you need to invest? So there are huge opportunities. And just on the investing aspect, so many supply chain companies will be willing to invest, but they will only invest when they see a secure pipeline of work coming. But they won't get that until the projects reach FID, or final investment decision, which leaves it too late for some of them to invest to be able to build the infrastructure that's needed or whatever. So there is an element of risk that's involved. And traditionally, the offshore wind sector was or is quite risk averse. Or let's put it another way, they can only handle so much risk in their project. I mean, it used to be quite risky to put something that moved, the turbine, out into the water and send electricity back to shore. Now that's not so risky now because we've got a lot of fixed bed wind farms and wind turbines. But let's see, putting something that moves, the wind turbine, onto something else that moves, the floating structure, and then sending the power back to shore. So that's quite risky. So using new products and services or suppliers on top of these already quite risky projects can make it too much of a challenge, too much risk for the developers, or let's face it, their financiers or their insurers. So we need to try and minimize the risk. And that's why sometimes developers and tier ones go back to their own supply chain because it minimizes the risk. But of course, as I say, if it's a fixed project, they've done fixed before, so it shouldn't be that too challenging. So the supply chain, where do they sit within the life cycle of a wind farm? So is it during the project development phase when we're doing all the surveys, surveying above the sea, the birds, etc., the ocean conditions or the seabed conditions? Is it going to be during the designing the wind farm as well? Or is your company going to be during the construction and installation of the various parts of the wind farm, whether it be the turbine, the substation, the cables, guard vessels to protect all these? Or is it during the O&M phase of maintaining the entire wind farm? And then there's the decommissioning at the end. And that's not happened to such a degree yet, but there is also part that needs to be considered. Another significant challenge is the scale. The supply chain needs to be ready for the size of everything, making, moving, and maintaining these massive structures, because they just keep on getting bigger and bigger. And we've got in this one that 13 to 15 megawatts within the next couple of years. I anticipate that that's going to be 18 to 20 megawatts within the next 5 years beyond that. And who knows when it's going to stop. So that's another challenge for the supply chain. Do they have vessels large enough to transport and install these? Are the quays strong enough and long enough to have these huge products sitting on them? Is the sea deep enough to have the massive vessels come into shore, or the floating structures come into shore? Does the quayside need dredged regularly? And all of these things, yes, you can do them, but none of them are cheap. But having a good ports and harbours infrastructure is vital for so much of the supply chain. Because the products are massive, they're often made at quayside and then just shipped over. You can't put them on road. You can put some products on road, but the really big ones, you can't. So that's something that the supply chain, and particularly the ports and harbours, have to be wary of. And when is the opportunities? So at which part of the project does the supply chain's product or service, is it needed? Is it during the first few years when you're looking at various sites and the consenting and the project development phase? is it during the O&M phase, which in this slide it says 40 years, but actually that could be 50 or more years, because the ScotWind leasing, that's for 60 years. So let's take off 10 years at the beginning for construction, and then you've got 50 years of a lifetime, and that could be extended beyond that. And how often will turbines have to be repaired, replaced between that? So the O&M opportunities are significant. And that's where a supply chain has to realize, well, when do I need to speak to my customer, and who is my customer? And actually, if I have O&M phase, but they've probably got 10 years before they get into O&M phase, do I need to talk to them now? Well, maybe I do, because something that they're installing in the wind farm, well, actually, they should be installing something else to minimize the amount of maintenance that's needed. But that can be the challenge of who do you speak to and when do you speak to them? And of course, we've spoken a lot about what the supply chain needs. And let's face it, that's the really important ones, because without a supply chain, you don't have a wind farm. What do the governments want out of this? Now, I may be wrong here, but I think it's jobs. It's long-term jobs, it's sustainable jobs, it's diverse jobs, it's green jobs, but it's all about jobs. And as we saw the hockey stick of opportunities in the global market earlier on, there's going to be a lot of demand for supply chain and a lot of demand for people. So we're needing to look at, do we need to retrain current individuals that are doing something else, possibly in oil and gas? And it's encouraging more people into the industry from an early age, because people working on many of the projects that are coming up will currently be in the primary or nursery schools. And yes, we do need to encourage people from different backgrounds to get into science-based courses so they can become the engineers of the future. But they are not the only jobs that are available in the energy sector. There are many other jobs like welding, surveying, marketing, and many more that are also needed in the sector. So we need to think about who are we going to get to be working on all these projects, and we need to start working on that now. Because that's another thing, the whole timing issue is that, giving Scotland, for example, we have 25 gig coming in 10 years' time. So we need to ensure that our ports and harbours are ready. Well, that takes a hell of a long time and a lot of money to get your ports and harbours ready. And then you need all the right people. Well, we've got a shortage of welders at the moment. We've got a shortage of engineers at the moment. That's just now. What's it going to look like in 5-10 years' time? So we need to put in the groundwork now to retrain the individuals, to get the school leavers in at all stages. And what else does the government need to consider? Well, where are these jobs coming from? Are they going to be in the big cities? And that's fine, because you've probably got a bigger pool of talent and individuals to pick from. Or is it going to be in more remote, smaller towns and villages? And actually, if it is, then if you can retrain a lot of individuals out there, then that's significant, because that could keep the livelihoods and the village community going. And it might be in smaller fishing villages that they may be changing their industry as well. So that can be a real impact on the more remote communities. And can existing companies upscale and start to do more? Or do you need inward investors? Or should they be partnering? And do we have the infrastructure and facilities for inward investors to come to? And what support mechanisms should the public sector be putting in place? And how much do you need to put in place? Because everybody will ask you for money. The developers, the tier, anybody that's coming will go, we'll certainly come and locate with you, but you need to help us. But to what scale? And how much can you push and ask the industry for? And I would say that in the UK, we were very polite to begin with. We were very British and very polite, and asked the developers, can you please try really hard with your local content? Okay, I'm paraphrasing, but can you try really hard? Please try and use local content. And they were like, yes, we will absolutely try and use local content. But this project is a bit challenging and we need to do it in a hurry. So we're going to use their existing supply chain first. But don't you worry, next project, we'll come back and we'll use local content. And lo and behold, it hasn't quite worked out the way it should have. So that's why in the UK, we're pushing as far and as hard as we can to legally get local content. But it's very difficult without being globally anti-competitive. And that's something that you'll have to consider as well. How far can you push the industry? But again, going back to the globally competitive element, actually, a lot of the big companies internationally will be busy elsewhere. So you really need your own companies to grasp this industry and take it on. So that's just a quick canter of why I think offshore wind is a fantastic opportunity for all companies. And it's significant opportunities, but there are some challenges as well, but they can be overcome. Do we have any questions at all?
It looks like we have a question in the chat from Peter. Have you ever asked to review front-end engineering studies to fully understand the cost of localization?
So I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but developers will always tell you that, actually many companies will tell you, we can do it local, but local is more expensive. But that's not the case. It depends what you're comparing. If you're comparing large scale fabrication, then it may be more expensive elsewhere, unless you want to put in the significant infrastructure and fabrication requirements so that you can compete. Labor costs are always going to be challenging across the globe to compete with. So that's why you need to play to your strengths and go, well, actually, can we compete with that? Or do we, again, giving large scale foundations as an example, do we flat pack those so they can get made, the tubulars can get made abroad, and then they get brought over to the US or the UK, and they get welded together. So there are elements around it, but maybe actually your strengths are in digital or data or something else. So local content, it will be pushed back on, but it is very important, and it's not always more expensive. People will say, oh, it's always more expensive. It's not. You just need to make sure you're comparing apples with apples.
Thank you. I see, Stephanie, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thanks, Isla. Great presentation. I was at a webinar recently that the Business Network for Offshore Wind held with Exodus Group. They had an interesting panel of kind of a local economic development cluster representatives, but also some developers. And I found it really interesting that the developers were asking the supply chain companies to be prepared and come forward and let them know how they could contribute and be good partners in the projects. And meanwhile, the local supply chain folks were saying, well, we need more information from you, the developers, in terms of what you might need and when, so that we can better understand how we can fit in. So it seems like there's two directions of communication necessary there, and just wondering if you had any suggestions on how to facilitate that.
That is absolutely the challenge. It's communication or miscommunication or not having timely communication, and having sat on all sides of the fence. And I'm going to say there's more than two sides of the fence here. So having sat in public sector, and you say to the developers, why are you not getting more local content? And they'll say, oh, well, those damn tier ones, if only we could get it. So damn tier ones won't give us the local content. And then you sit in a developer's shoes and they'll go, well, absolutely, we'll use, well, certain developers, but the developers say, yeah, well, absolutely. But it's key, Stephanie, as you say, you need to speak early to the supply chain. And that is one thing that Scotland in particular has pushed now with the supply chain development statement. So even before the developer gets a site, they need to have an idea of who they're speaking to, when they're speaking to, why they're speaking to them. And yes, that will change. And they have given figures of the possible percentage and spend in Scotland, and it's significant. And they have to commit to that. And that will change. But initially 12 months, and then every 3 years, they have to say how that is changing. So that's really pushed the developers to have early conversations with the supply chain. And that's the very start, because that's given them the time frame of, okay, right, well, you need 75 floating turbines made out of concrete. We don't have the facilities. We better speak to the Scottish government to see if we can get the facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So that has started that. But communication is key, and having the cluster organizations helps. And I think that it's making sure that everybody's speaking to each other as well. And there will always be some competition, but if you can have some collaboration and competition, and having the ports and harbors involved in that conversation as well, because they are key as well. Because there won't be that many that are sitting with tons and tons of ideal space waiting to be used, but they can shift things around and then maximize the opportunity for the sites as well.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Can I ask one follow-up question? Because I know during the time of the sector deal, one of the things that, and this is relevant to the U.S. states as they've, and I think of Massachusetts most recently, altering the legislation to allow for a weighted. They changed the way that the awards were made for the power purchase agreement. So this is where the states have the control over, to the developers of buying the power. And by incorporating, the local content issue into this, either through a project labor agreement or the actual materials, in Scotland and in the UK, I understood that one of the flaws was that the auditing process in the early rounds of the builds was difficult to achieve. And I think now with the new Scotland legislation that the supply chain document has some teeth into it, I guess, some penalties that if you fail to meet your obligations, that there is recourse. And if I understood correctly, both in the US and in the UK, it was sorry, but now there's been a change. I think the Scottish Parliament has put some penalties into that.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the commitments and the ambitions figure, so you have to say how much you're going to spend in Scotland, in the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world. And so all developers, successful developers, have said that figure. That will then be, and if it changes, that's fine. They realize it will change, but you have to say why, how, what you've done to try and maximize the local content. And if it's clear that you've not made an effort, then you'll be spoken to by the First Minister, and there'll be ramifications. But that's fine. But also, so you've said that you're going to spend 50 million in Scotland. And if you're bang on that, that's fine, it's great. If the varying degrees of how far away you are from that, you will be financially penalised. And there is a percentage, and I can't remember what percentage it is you drop. But if it's such a big difference, then you can't step over to your lease, and therefore you can't build. So that means there's like, right, no, you're not allowing to build, but you can change it and go, okay, well, actually, let's try and see if we can fix this problem. And if they fix the problem, then they can build. But it is everything's okay, and then financial penalty, the worst you get, and then the worst case scenario is they're just not allowed to build. And that's for Scotland. So that's the SCDS. So that's fine. They've gone, but they also, to get their contract for difference, their CFD, they have a supply chain plan that they have to write, and that goes to BASE, the UK government, and you can pass and fail that as well. So you might have passed at Scotland, but then you get to the UK government and you can fail if you're not reaching your local content targets. And it's not just percentage, it's about how you're having a diverse workforce, how you're engaging with the supply chain. So there are multiple things that you need to do and therefore can fail against as well. So it's encouraged being a good developer as well.
And just a note, Drew dropped in a link to the supply chain development statement summary. So that gives a nice overview for those who want to look into that.
If there aren't any more questions, our next speaker is John McCaskill from OWC. John, I think you are here.
Yes, yeah, I'm here, ready, keyed up, and teed up, ready to go. If at the right time, just let us know.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we're ready for you to go. Thank you.
Okay. Well, okay, I'm going to share. So, right. Okay. Do I share or do you? Yeah, I'll just share my screen. There we go.
Yes, please, if you don't mind.
I'll do. So just give us a second. And I don't multitask, so normally it'd be good to introduce myself while I'm doing this, but I do find that difficult. So could you let me know that you see this? Can everyone see a screen?
Yes, we see it. Thank you, John. Excellent.
Well, thanks for the invitation. This was given in Houston about a month ago. So hopefully I'm not too rusty. And I'm going to try and whiz through to allow questions, etc. And I've hidden a few slides as well, which will be available in the deck, but they're not material. So the first thing is, so just first, why did I present this? there's a lot of sort of conferences that you'll go to, and when they talk about ports, you'll see a lot of this is what a barge, this is how you manufacture 50 barges, this is how you manufacture 50 TLPs, etc., which is fantastic because you need to know all this kind of stuff. But there was a couple of people in front of me, and I knew they were going to be presenting that. So I stood back a little bit and tried to sort of look at a bigger picture. And that's what you're getting here. So there's not a lot of lovely drawings with stuff. It's really about the issue around ports and actually how ports work with a developer, because we work on the developer side. So the first thing is no port, no project. But also it's so key for local content, because that's so for instance, an offshore wind farm in the southern North Sea in the UK, for instance, if the port strategy had, Denmark, someone in Belgium, and then a big assembly port in Holland, how easy is it for us to actually, leverage local content into a project where the actual port strategy is not in the country or the state? It is difficult. So it's a huge element for local content, but also for the project. And of course, as we said, the technical aspects of a floating foundation is absolutely key, but there's other things that are required. And the other thing is that if a state or a region or a country does not have the right port infrastructure at the right time, projects may go elsewhere. Now, they're not going to lift their project and take that anywhere else, but basically they will have a port strategy and we're going to take you through what that looks like a little bit. But basically, you will find that maybe the ports that rise to the top when they're looking at the different elements of uses of ports, that actually, looking at the risk and the costs and the contingency requirements, it's best to go elsewhere. So in other words, the projects will go elsewhere for that, and you will find that your port just doesn't reach where it needs to be. And there's also a bit of a duality, because obviously in the UK and Scotland, we've got trust ports and private ports, but they're all individual. So there isn't a big body saying, right, people, you, Mr. Port A, are going to be doing this, Mr. Port B is going to be doing this. So they're all in it themselves. So it's competition. But you need to collaborate. And what you might be hearing elsewhere today is the word clustering, which is quite an important thing, I think, for Scotland, which has been a very, I think, important activity, and I think is going to be really key to try and optimize our infrastructure between here and 2030. And of course, when a port gets a contract, it's actually too late to develop or modify your port. So, you need to build confidence in advance of that to be able to make those early investments. And it's that delta between, hard and fast contracts and building enough confidence. And, how can you build those steps? And you might need, government or state help, etc. So a very short bit about who we are. We're a consultant, so we don't develop, we develop for clients. We're a marine and energy consultant, so we work in renewables, we work in maritime, we work in offshore. The only thing you really need to know is that I come from the OWC side, so I come from the offshore wind side, is that we're really experienced. We've got that's last year's stats, but so that was what we'd done up to last year, about 233 and about 120 gigawatts, with 31 floating. But last year, so on top of that, we worked on about 99 new offshore wind farms and about 70 gigawatts of capacity. And we were the technical advisor, so the engineering advisor on doing the bids for about 20% of all the successful ScotWind awards. So we went out. And I'll leave this for you guys, but we are very established in the US. So we've got group offices from Boston, Columbus, right through on the East Coast, down to the Gulf, Houston, and on the West Coast in Seattle. Our offshore wind offices are Boston and New York, and we've done numerous work from Block Island up to the West Coast, where we're doing grid studies. We're a technical advisor for an offshore developer on the West Coast as well. So we're very established, very experienced there. So that's the bit. An anatomy of an offshore wind farm. Well, from a Scottish perspective, as you know, in Scotland, we expected about 11 gigawatts on the spatial plan, but we got 25, and 15 gigawatts of that is floating, a huge pipeline. Now, at the moment, floating projects will be possible, steel in the water or concrete in the water between 29 and 31. I would put a slap up dinner that it's going to be nearer 31 than 29. just because there's just so many challenges to get steel or concrete in the water for that size of floating project. We've really only got one prospective sort of hub, which will be NIG at the moment. We've got very adequate O&M capacity, because obviously we've got a number of ports that have serviced the offshore sector, which fit really quite well into this kind of requirements that you need for O&M. We've got relatively limited manufacturing and fabrication and assembly, which we'll go through. And the other issue I will be revisiting again is this, that it's a bit of a free market, so it requires coordination. So the first thing is, what's the needs of a floating wind project? So the first thing you see in a port is it will be a bit of a supply base for the geotech and the condition surveys. Nothing really needed for that. Nice work if we can get it, but it's not major. But that's the first activity you'll see in a project. The sizable will be the construction phase. So there's a number of elements of that. Obviously, the construction of the fabrication for the floater. Then you've got lots of quayside requirements dotted around. So you're going to need to make blades, you're going to have nacelles, you'll have towers, and all of these needs to be at quayside. So these are other port demands. You've then got the fit out of the integration. So you've got the floater and you've got the turbine components where you will integrate that. Now, alongside that, or in proximity, or maybe even at another port, if the port can't sustain the amount of components for the assembly cycle, you'll have major load down areas for the turbine components, for mooring. There's a lot of mooring required for floating, and the marshal, and sort of also for things like dynamic cable and anchors, etc. Now, there'll be technicians, etc., going offshore as well. So there's probably going to be some support required during that installation phase with construction SOVs, etc., and also a wet area for storage if needed. Ideally, that is the one facility, that's the one port, ideally. And then you've got the O&M hub and the port. And what obviously we don't want as an industry, but what you'll probably also need is you're going to have unplanned key component replacement, because these projects, these large turbines will come with some serial defects on some projects. And at the moment, you unplug these and tow them back, which is not going to be the solution. That cannot happen. It's just not going to be. But imagine the port requirement for needing to replace blades on 50 units. That's a big win for a port, but a very bad one for the industry. So ports fall into three main categories: fabrication and the manufacturing element phase, the marshalling and assembly, the O&M. Now, if you then combine 1 and 2, that is your hub port, that's your super port. Now, what does that look like? So this is an artist's representation from Port Talbot in Wales for APB, which is a port, and they've had a look at the port, and they've had a look at how they can modify that port to become some semblance of a hub port, primarily. And the example they've used here is the WindFloat semi-submersible, which is absolutely funny because actually we're looking at that one for a WindFloat project, which is the Erebus in the Celtic Sea. So let's get a little tour of what a port could look like. So the first one is the manufacturing and components. So you might well have the ability to have a large area at one part of the port where you could maybe have blade manufacturing, or you've got tower manufacturing, which would be excellent because that would serve more than one project, and it would be for a long period of time. So that would be, materials coming in, fabrication, assembly, whatever. You've also got the fabrication of the floater itself. Now, since this case it's the semi-submersible, then what you've probably got here is bringing steel plates in, preparing and edging, making them into cans, connecting them, growing them into the size of the hull. And then you've got the assembly area where you would then put the components together, weld them, and then finish them off, and then load them out onto a semi-submersible, a semi-sub barge. You're going to need laydown areas, because even though you might have one factory, the chances are you will need to bring in other components in preparation for the assembly. So you will have to have, whether you've got a tower manufacturing facility in the port, you will still need towers, you will still need the nacelles, etc. So you've got the fit out and integration at the quayside. You've probably got a wet storage area, and you've got tow outs. So that's a representation of what you would expect to see in a large hub. And of course, if it's a smaller harbour, then you might be doing an element of that. So what's the challenges for ports? One of them is different floaters on fixed. So if this was a fixed project and you were looking at monopiles, then the monopile will change in weight, it will change in length. At a distance, it will look like every other monopile. And apart from the numbers that you need to put on the quayside and maybe the full weights underneath the SPMTs, there's actually not a big difference between them. So you've got maybe one coming from Blatt, you've got one coming from EEW, you've got one coming from SIF, but actually they're all the same. In floating wind, you've got different foundation types, and they drive different needs because they're different sizes. They've got, some of them are not stable enough to put the turbine on unless it's on the, unless it's actually fixed or actually anchored to the ground. So they've all got different needs. And the challenge for ports is that what projects don't do is look at look at site conditions and take the site conditions and then the port infrastructure and then say which foundation, which floater suits that. That's not the way around they do this. Usually they will be pulling a floating company in strategically as a strategic partner, and then they'll look at, right, okay, we've chosen a barge. Does the port infrastructure nearby suit that barge? So in other words, it's a compromise. And of course, all offshore wind projects is the art of compromising. Everything is what's possible on a project. The other issue is distance. So you've got the project and you've got your port, and they're fixed. But depending on what your port is going to be allocated, what kind of work, then you've got a distance sensitivity. Because with weather windows, with met ocean conditions, with what the actual sort of the tow or the transportation is, that will have an impact on risk. Now that diagram on the right hand side is from an excellent document which I would recommend that you source. It was done by the Crown Estate Scotland and ahead of ScotWind, which was looking at sort of the pluses and minuses of some of the ports. So it's a very good report to read. And what you can see there is the sensitivity circles for the assembly and assembly ports. Now they've used about 108 nautical miles as that kind of sensitivity. And as you can see, depending on the activity, you've got different sensitivities. If you've got a CTV, you're not wanting them doing 108 nautical miles and taking about 4 hours of making the technicians sick to do 2 hours on a turbine and coming back. So everything, so that all dictates what kind of port that you think you're going to be positioning for and the distance that you are. Now, those distances, they're ideal. Every project will work with some kind of suboptimal. And then it's a matter of, okay, how do we accommodate the risk? How do we mitigate the risk, which is a cost and a contingency. So again, it impacts the commerciality of the choice of import. Now, floating brings more certainty than risk. We're pretty comfortable with what the risks are on fixed, but there's pluses and minuses on floating. The first thing is we're not taking a massive jack-up out, so the cost of the vessels actually are reducing that. So in a straight spreadsheet, that reduces the distance sensitivity because you're probably using tugs or anchor handlers, etc. However, look at what they're towing. They're towing a floating structure with a turbine on it with a hub height of about 150 or 170 meters, with significant risk to met ocean conditions to get to the permanent station. So a significant amount of risks around the distance, in other words, just where you are located as a port. The other one is the logistics actually on the port. One of the pluses about floating is that you do major installation and integration actually at the quayside, so you're not doing it offshore. But there's a huge, at the moment, lack of heavy lift cranes. So when we're doing port and harbour studies for projects in the UK, there's just not many of these cranes going about at all because of the lift radius, because of the weights, because of the hub heights. There's just not enough of them. And the other issue is that they all come with different spreads. So if you can see at the bottom there for the heavy lift integration berth, so if you've got a quayside and we're sort of we're looking at it as a project. One project that we recently looked at had we found 4 different cranes that could be available for that installation slot, that time window, but they actually, because they had different spreads, some of them were about 15 tons per square meters, the other ones were about 24.5 tons per square meters. And of course, the quayside is what the quayside is. So does the quayside need modifying? Do we need to put spreaders in, etc.? So the logistics itself is quite considerable. So getting fit for purpose. We mentioned the market because one of the issues is that there isn't a government body here saying, right, okay, we've got a 15 gigawatt pipeline of floating projects. How can we optimize and how can we, take all our port infrastructure and do it? So they're not government businesses, they're not government infrastructure like we have in some areas of the continent. So it's all about when ports are looking at upgrades or port expansions, it's all in business confidence, because I've mentioned that if at one point when there's a contract ready to be laid, it's too late to do major modifications or port upgrades. So you're having to do this in advance. So it's all to do with business confidence. And left unchecked, that means that there'll be a continual undersupply, because by the time you get confidence, analyze the data, make the business case, get the financing, make the financial decision, and then go off and do it, the chances are that process, that iterative process, is always going to be a bit too late. And what that means, there'll be a lack of readiness. Now, we've mentioned that every project deals with, it's not optimal. There isn't a perfect port. There's no perfect distance. There's nothing perfect. But turbine OEMs and EPCIs, etc., come in with their installation strategies. So they will come in with their methodologies, which is they base their bids on and things like this. So they've got the ideal way of working it. Now, every project, therefore, looks at the ports available, and you start to unwrap that strategy a bit. So you say, well, we can't do this. We've got to do this instead. We can't do this. We can't do this instead. And what you want to do is do as little unwrapping as possible, because basically the more you unwrap, it increases risk and cost. And that makes so if I've got to unwrap my project a bit more for port A versus port B, that will make your port less competitive or have more risks of possible schedule delay, etc. So if I run the CapEx on using your port, there might be a larger contingency. All this kind of thing comes into it. The other risk is that if ports aren't collaborating, if we're trying to collaborate a bit, then what you might find is sort of short-termism a little bit. So you might find that ports make sort of, grab something which just allows them to get that contract, to sign something and get that quayside, leased, used for a period of time. Now, what that might mean is if you then stand back and look at all the infrastructure available and the needs for a pipeline of work, that one port decision that might have made sense for that port may not make sense for everything else. Because it might be that port grabbed a couple of O&M contracts, and that might impact them being able to be a large sort of, an assembly or a manufacturing port. So again, this comes back to sort of clustering, which is very difficult because ports are, if a port is an individual port, it'll be making decisions based on an individual port, but that might not be optimal for the full pipeline of projects. So in Scotland, there's been, there has been some thinking around this, and there's some very good reports out there as well. So the first thing is we do need to increase our marshalling and assembly capacity. And because, again, we don't have a government able to go in and say, right, this is what we're doing. So we need to increase that confidence. Now, that has happened, we've had a significant uptake of that with Scotland, with the amount of projects, because there's going to be some projects that get delayed. There might be a project that falls off the side. The amount of capacity there does give confidence. Now, we're not sure which project is going to be first and what that project looks like, etc. So there's a level of uncertainty, but we've had an improvement of certainty. The other thing is we need, you need to try and make sure that there's that there's enough of a fund, there's enough of a pool of capital available to make the right large port infrastructure enhancements and amendments. So obviously, one project's not going to allow a port to have a major port enhancement. So a number of projects will. So basically trying to encourage that pooling, and that might need some regional government support, coordination as much as possible between projects, if that's possible, and clustering, etc. Strategic port planning, we've mentioned the business as usual market iteration approach is not great. So we need to try and, so yeah, we just need more strategic port planning is very much ideal, which delivers everything that we've just mentioned above. And the other thing is the ideal port has a very large industrial hinterland with a skilled workforce, an available workforce, especially for the sort of, below tier 2 and below supply chain companies, because obviously the tier 1s will be companies that tend to come in and sort of, and build a factory there, which supplies jobs, which is great. But your domestic companies, the SMEs, the small, medium-sized enterprises, ideally you're wanting them to sort of move into offshore wind. So ideally, you've got a really good industrial base near your port. So if you're a port, what does working with a project look like? So this is just going to take you through a little bit about what it looks like and how important this is about building confidence. So the first thing is you need to engage with the offshore wind market, which I know is not exactly rocket science, but that's the first thing you do. So every port has future port strategy, future port strategy plan, etc. So you've got to do a new iteration of that. You have a look at the offshore wind market, you do a look ahead. You understand to a degree at this point port requirements, and you make and then you've got a document there, you can start marketing your port. So you're starting to engage with the market, developers, OEMs, EPCs, industry bodies, governments, etc. And again, you've had a little uptake in that confidence and clarity at that point. But then the project starts, right? So the project happens, and a port's on the outside. So what happens on the inside? Well, the first thing is developers using people like us will do a pre-feed, we'll do an early stage feasibility study, which is very desktopy orientated. So it'll take lots of public information, but it'll also go out with questionnaires. It will have, it'll have Zoom calls or visits, and we'll get information. And what that will be processed, and what that will produce is a shortlist, because we will have a foundation at this point, because the chances are there's a foundation that's already in the project, as we've mentioned. So we know it's going to be an ideal barge, or we know it's going to be a principal power wind float or whatever. So we've had a look at sort of a manufacturing strategy, and we'll understand that we want to have a hull fabrication port. We will need to have an assembly port, etc., an O&M port, etc. And that might be the same port, but they are the needs. And then we'll start sort of having a look at, and it'll be a list, it'll be a long list, and we'll be weighing up those different ports. So that'll produce a short list. It produces the first port strategy that will be evolved during the. So the port strategy will be, well, there's actually a massive port there, so we're going to go for a hub port strategy, or not. The ports are really quite small, so we don't want to go far away, because France has got a really big port that's suitable, but we need to be closer, so we're going to go with a multi-port strategy. So that'll dictate a strategy a bit, and it feeds into the T&I, the transport and installation strategy. So we'll have done the pre-feed, the early stage feasibility, and then we move into feed. So what you do is we'll take that piece of work. It would have been evolved by the package manager and the team in the ports and harbours part, but we'll also take the outputs from the because there'll be a feasibility study on the turbine package, on the mooring package, on the cable package, etc., etc. So all these inputs will come back in to do a baseline. So this will be a much more detailed baseline feed study. Now, what this has done is this has probably started to whittle down, because we've kicked the tires a bit more of some of these ports. So we're now identifying the ports we might well be wanting to use, and that will then step up our engagement with those ports. And then it goes into a second stage, which is a more detailed port assessment. So again, during feed, the turbine package, the mooring package, a whole bunch of work's being done in these areas, and it all feeds back in to produce a detailed port assessment, because this then goes into the very first round of ITTs, which we will then put out to EPCIs. So And of course, when we've went out to EPCIs, we'll get responses. So that third iteration is again continuous work with new work coming in from the different packages, but with the results from the EPCIs in it as well. So it'll be a much more informed piece of work. Now, if your port is still in the game at this point, you've probably had an NDA, you've been getting worked on, there's been work going to and flow. So basically confidence and clarity has increased significantly. Now, we've not reached FID on the project yet, so there's no contracts to hand. But your confidence will be up significantly. So you will be part of the project team. There probably has been some press releases because that's what happens. So at one point during that, if we've whittled down to your port as the port for the integration, the chances are we've announced it, we've done some nice photographs. But obviously there's a CapEx story to be done. So there'll be a third, there'll be discussions with a range of stakeholders, etc. There might be some modifications done. So there's a whole bunch of things that go, but that is how you build confidence. And of course, that last one then feeds into the procurement element and also the detailed CapEx and OpEx. And so that's what happens on the inside. So as conclusion, you've got to have a clear port strategy, but one that looks ideally, don't just look at your port. Have a look at the wider port infrastructure because you're part of a larger story. The chances are there'll be multiple ports. I mean, you saw the photograph of Port Talbot. If that was, the chances are, if the construction iteration for an assembly of that wind float with the turbine on it, if that needed that needs a certain amount of components over, say, a 3-week period to do a number of units in iteration. If you're coming from another harbour, then a vessel will contain an optimal amount of parts. You might not be able to get all those parts from one load into that laydown area because you need to have a balance of parts. You need to have the right amount of parts to do X number of units. Now, if that's the case, that your port doesn't match the sort of shipping loads, you might need a supplemental port somewhere else where it comes in, and then you've got like a shuttle barge service with parts. So as you can see, there's a lot of moving parts in it. So you need to have a look at, ideally, you want to have a look at the wider port, even if so it just allows you to make your better decisions. Look at your current state. What does your port have at the moment? Understand the needs and requirements, develop that strategy and keep doing so. Do you need to work in clusters? I'll mention clusters again. Engage with developers. I mean, we're quite surprised that, that we'll get some ports that will invite us in and they'll do work. They'll produce general assembly drawings quite early. They're still in a they know we're speaking with other ports, so it's maybe at feasibility stage, but they'll be very helpful. And then you've got ports that will send their marketing material to you. So engage with developers. It is noticed who is really, really helpful, etc. And try and get the necessary confidence for port expansion and modification. And as you can see there's some of the clustering areas that ScotWind is currently looking at as well. So that's it. Thanks for, I think I've rushed through it, but hopefully not too fast. And hopefully it was useful. And any questions, happy to answer them for as much time you've got.
Thank you so much, John. Yes, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Please just raise your hand or put it in the chat. Drew, I see you have your hand up.
Right, thank you, John. This was fantastic, really great tour, particularly looking at the division of port possibilities in Scotland. There are a number of folks on this group who are representing ports on the west coast of the US. It has some similarities. Not very many ports that are available, not much laydown area that's available. Do you or other groups, have you been doing any assessments in that market since it's in the very early stages?
So we've just started a piece of work. So I mean, we've got personnel in San Francisco and elsewhere because we've got a ports and harbours team that do work for maritime ports. So we'll come in and do we're not a civil construct, we're not a civil engineer, but when civil engineer needs sort of ports and harbours work, more sort of detailed work, we then do that. So we've done work in a number of ports, but they're big container ports, etc., etc. So we've got an understanding of what's on the West Coast, but in terms of our wind team, we're just about to start a piece of work for a developer. And I think it's actually on the list there. We can't name the developer, but it's for, I think I've mentioned Morro Bay, which I think is okay. So we've started that piece of work. But we haven't got another piece of work that was on ports. We've done grid and infrastructure on the West Coast for another developer. We've done, I think we've done some bid prep, and we've done some wind assessments, but we're just about to start our first piece of work, which includes supply chain and port infrastructure.
So if I could follow up for a second, John, I guess given the structure of the folks who are here on this group and some of their intent, it seems to me there would be tremendous value in a similar study to the one that Scotland and others have done, which is looking across the not so much from the developer's point of view or from an individual port, but what are the opportunities for clustering? There are so few ports, and there's such large ambitions. There really doesn't seem any other solution but to adopt a similar approach. And I don't know which organization would sponsor that, but it seems like that's a really good model here.
I agree, because the other risk is if there's few ports, you'll find a project coming in that's planting its flag, which is fine for the project, fine for the port, but again, it might be less optimal. So, if there's a fear that there's not enough infrastructure, the earliest projects will try and tie down that infrastructure, which again is great for that project, because every project's out for their own, themselves, and it might be great for the port, but it might not be great for the whole market. Now, you can't dictate the market, but I think educating the market and showing the opportunity, and because actually, there is a benefit to an individual project for a pipeline, because that brings in more content, which drives down costs. It's just that they've got their own raison d'etre, they've got their own schedule, they've got their own investors, etc. But so you do need to I think you need to show them this opportunity, because no one else will. The project developer won't look at the bigger picture. One port probably won't look at the bigger picture. And that kind of piece of work allows you to have a dialogue with everyone, and they start to think about how that kind of more holistic view would work. So totally, I think some of the reports that have been done in advance of Scotland have been very helpful, because it just gives everyone the bigger picture.
Well, thank you very much. I think there was another piece that you mentioned, but since it's not hugely relevant in Scotland, it maybe didn't occur to many people, but many of our ports, even our container ports, are constrained by the height of the bridges that gap the sort of entrance into the port, so that the European approach of standing up turbines, fixed foundation turbines, is more or less a non-starter on the East Coast. But you now have the challenge with the floating projects on the West Coast. There are obviously a few ports, Seattle's a good example, where they don't have that constraint, whereas Oakland, San Francisco, I would guess, does. But could you speak a little bit to, even if you had a kind of working number of what's the current height constraint?
Well, the hub height will be about, so on top of the floater, I mean, obviously you might, but no, you won't need to ballast it down. So if you've got the rotors on it, then it will be the smallest height will be like the bunny ears. So you'll have one rotor going vertically down, which means the other two blades will be as low as possible, which would probably mean that you're looking at about 200, maybe the turbines that you'll see at the end of the decade might be between 250 meters, 235 to 250 meters, because you would, that little drawing, oh no, you don't see it. So I'll just move the slide to, whoops, yeah. So the picture on the right, on the left-hand side, that's nearly at the lowest. So that blade that's vertically down, you would have that aligned with the tower, and then the two blades here would be as low as they can get. So they've got the hub heights of the future turbines are anything up to 170 meters, and then the tip height above the nacelle might be an additional 30 to 40 meters. And then you'd need clearance, obviously, as well. And this is why, so thinking about that, Drew, is that there might have to be another way of doing this, which is, you know, you use the port upstream, you know, upstream, upriver of the bridge. You might, the strategy I can think of might be, you certainly do your manufacturing. You'll do, you might even, depending on the height of the bridge, you might even be able to do the everything except the rotor.
Yeah.
And then you would look for a smaller port that you might pull in one at a time to then maybe do a rotor or something. But there's also some people thinking that, you know, there's such a thing as steel case, as concrete caisson port facilities. I mean, in World War II, we built these, you know, the massive concrete harbours, the Mulberry harbours, and then towed them to France. You know, there is discussions that actually, you know, something like that might be an option to supplement infrastructure. I mean, it's perfectly engineeringly sound. So, you know, but again, for that kind of thing, you probably need a pipeline. So, you know,
yeah.
But yeah,
to give you an example, the Golden Gate Bridge clearance, I think, is about 67 meters. So okay. that eliminates, you know, the Port of Oakland and many substantial port facilities inside there. Port of Seattle is a major deep water port. It's a long ways away, but it may be a key provider. Morro Bay is quite small. And then pretty much you go all the way down to Long Beach, Los Angeles, before you find another port of any size. So it's
going to be an interesting study. I mean, you could probably, you know, so if you needed to do the San Francisco area, I mean, obviously you'd be able to do part of the tower, but you'd still need another port to then finish it off. So the question then is, you know, can the other port do the other elements and not tow it? So yeah, that's quite interesting. I mean, it could go to a shallow area and use a jackup. So I mean, you know, you could. The reason you don't use jackups for this installation is because it's too deep when it's in the field. But theoretically, you could go to a relatively shallow area that's sort of just outside the port or in some sort of, you know, an area, and actually use a jackup there and do it like anything else. But you'd need to probably bottom out the. You could do that actually. You could probably do that with the right wind conditions. So there's ways of doing it, but again,
don't want to hold everything up. It will be very fascinating to figure out the logistics.
And everything's going to be a compromise. But that's a project.
Yeah. Thank you.
If there aren't any other questions, we'll move on to our next speaker, James Battensby from ORE Catapult.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'll just share my.
So I'll just stop sharing and I'll dodge out. And thanks for everyone. And hi, James.
Thanks, John.
Hi, John.
Yes, thanks, everyone. Bye.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give an overview of the ORE Catapult and our floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence initiative here in the UK. So I'll explain a little bit about the background of what the Floating Offshore Wind Centre is, some of the activities we're undertaking, both in terms of technology and supply chain development here in the UK. Apologise if I cover anything that the previous speakers may have sort of been in another meeting here, so just joined the session now. So I'll start the presentation. So yeah, essentially, floating offshore wind is clearly a big growth area for the UK and Scotland in particular. So I think probably you've no doubt heard a lot about the case for floating offshore wind, you know, deeper sites, higher wind speed capacity. And certainly in the UK, we're looking to try and make it subsidy free by 2030. And it's going to play a critical role in achieving our net zero ambitions by 2050. So with the UK Committee on Climate Change targeting 100 gigawatts by 2050, with a significant proportion potentially being from floating offshore wind. In terms of the global opportunity as well, clearly, yeah, in the US, there's several deep water sites, and obviously the West Coast is primarily deep water. We've also had projects in the Asia Pacific region around South Korea and in Japan and other areas. So there's quite a lot of global development over the next few years. And the UK does have the highest global installed capacity of floating wind. However, I would say that's not very much compared to fixed at the moment, but there's certainly massive plans for additional installation. And as John mentioned earlier, I think 14 gigawatts have been identified in the ScotWind round of the 25 gigawatts, which could be floating. And the UK has got a lot of experience in the North Sea in terms of offshore oil and gas and subsea engineering, which is clearly quite transferable into this sector. And we've done some studies that estimate, you know, that we could be seeing up to 30,000 UK jobs and 43 billion of GVA generated from the floating offshore wind sector. So a little bit about the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. For those who don't know us, we're the kind of leading research and technology organisation for offshore renewable technology in the UK. We have a number of researchers, engineers and technical staff. We're supported by the UK Innovation Agency, Innovate UK, and we operate a number of regional centres around the UK. Head offices in Glasgow and Scotland, and quite a lot of activity in Aberdeen and Fife. But across the rest of the UK as well, we have a number of regional centres which include testing infrastructure and also key researchers looking at different offshore renewable energy topics. We have a number of research hubs with some of the leading universities in the UK, and also an international innovation centre in China. In terms of what we do, we kind of broadly undertake three core functions. We have a test and validation, where we're looking at next generation turbines and balance of plant. Where I'm situated at the moment is in our Blythe Research Centre, which is in the north of England. And we're currently undertaking test and validation programme for GE for their Haliade 14 megawatt next generation turbine design. And then we undertake component testing and validation. The other strand of the business is we work with operations and maintenance. We work with about 90% of the current owner operators around Europe, looking at technologies for servicing, also digital technologies to reduce OPEX costs in terms of operation, and then validating new solutions for basically servicing of current offshore wind farms. And then we have the other area which I work in, which is termed research and disruptive innovation. And there we're looking at the kind of breakthrough technologies for offshore renewables. So green hydrogen and integration with hydrogen is a key activity we're looking at in terms of emerging technology, floating offshore wind that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, and then wave and tidal technologies as well. So quite a broad spectrum of activity. In terms of the Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence, this is basically a joint industry and government partnership we set up here in the UK to accelerate the commercialisation of floating offshore wind. Clearly there's huge potential, but quite a number of challenges that no doubt some of the various speakers have discussed today. So the core programme, you can see all of the members there, some kind of big international players you'd be aware of, like Shell and BP. EDF Energy, Ørsted, and quite a few other developers, many of which are also developing lease zones around the US as well at the moment. So the way the virtual centre is structured, basically we split the activity across 4 key work streams, looking at technical development and barriers to offshore wind deployment, be that in the installation or manufacturing or O&M areas, looking at how we really upscale supply chains and operations to deliver this kind of high capacity. You know, talking about moving from less than 100 megawatts to several gigawatts of deployment of floating offshore wind is quite a considerable challenge. And John made some really good points around the kind of port development and infrastructure required around sites which want to become major installation hubs. Then development and consenting. Clearly there's environmental issues that you need to consider in terms of dealing with the seabed, consenting around ecology for the offshore environment, and also dealing with landing grid installations and integration into national grid infrastructure, and itself takes various consenting regimes. And then how we deliver net zero as a holistic package. So how do we pull all of these strands together to ensure that we are on target for that 2050 goal? So we work with existing industry programs and initiatives to really accelerate the industry. So I'll try and give a bit of a flavour of some of those. To date, since 2019, when we pulled together the Floating Offshore Wind Centre, we've committed 3.5 million in various projects and leveraged quite significant industrial investment as well. We've basically worked with industry partners to frame industry challenges and look at where capability development's required, be that in substructure design, dynamic cable installation, looking at novel vessel deployment, and looking at key areas of common challenge and producing reports around that. Leveraging industry investment on one focused area so we can really accelerate the deployment, and looking at port infrastructure development as well, and broader infrastructure development across the electrical network. And then really working with supply chain partners to drive that economic growth and realize the kind of local content opportunities. So everyone wants, increased economic revenues for whichever country they're in. So how do you upskill the manufacturing base that you have at the moment to diversify into this sector, which is new and emerging from, say, the previous oil and gas sector or marine sector that you may have been working in. So this slide's a bit wordy, so apologies for that. But really, this is to give an overview of the 4 pillars I talked about earlier. So technical development, supply chain operations, development and consenting and delivering net zero. And these projects are a range of initiatives we're looking at. So you can see in the technical leg, there's things around looking at dynamic cabling systems, certification. So we have a common standard, technical standard for deployment of floating offshore wind, looking at mooring systems required in different geotechnical areas, and then really looking at moving on to supply chain and operations, how we deal with strategic infrastructure development. How do we build a business case to invest in this new infrastructure and support manufacturing, be it for the substructures or the various interface pieces that are required, and then looking at what is kind of state of the art for operations and maintenance. So do we have an operations and maintenance hub? Do we have a digital center that benchmarks performance of floating offshore wind? Looking at some of the key challenges with offshore wind is clearly at the moment you have a lot of wind turbines deployed on fixed base, but now we need to look at more integrated design to a dynamic floater. So that involves things like understanding the control system for the turbine to get the optimal annual energy production. And then also areas around development and consenting. So looking at how to mitigate negative impacts in relating to fishing or any kind of ecological assessment risks. and how we kind of address that in terms of understanding how to minimize impact and improve legislation in that respect. And then delivering net zero, obviously we're talking about integrating floating offshore wind. And if you think about the UK, you know, kind of for, you know, last sort of 30 years, we've had kind of base load generation from gas, nuclear and coal. And now we're kind of moving to an intermittent source. So how do we model that intermittent source around the coastline, moving into the central grid? So clearly things like energy storage, hydrogen, interconnectors all play a key role there. This is just to give more of a deep dive into some of the test facilities and infrastructure that we use for floating offshore wind and offshore wind in general. So we operate a range of facilities that you can see on the screen here. So we have, just change to laser pointer. So we have one of the world's largest indoor blade testing facilities, this 100-meter blade testing facility, where we look at a range of fatigue loads, which can be quite different in floating environments, given the dynamic nature of the floater. We optimize powertrain design, so undertaking highly accelerated lifetime testing. So in floating offshore wind sites, you may have more extreme environments. So how do we build the load cases for those to de-risk the turbine technology used on the floater? You know, we're kind of moving to 14, 15 megawatt plus at the moment. Looking at O&M technology and also dynamic cable design I mentioned here. So we recently commissioned this dynamic cable test rig, which basically undertakes a range of cyclic loads of representation that you would see for the cable connecting to the floater. So how do we understand the damage there to reduce the risk? Clearly, dynamic cabling is a key risk for floating offshore wind in terms of damage or fatigue. So that analysis that we do is really quite critical in that respect as well. This is just to give an idea of scale of some of the kind of blades and port infrastructure. So I'm actually in this office here at the moment. We're on the port of Blythe. This is our 100-meter blade testing facility, 50 megawatt drivetrain. So this is just to give an insight into, you're really dealing with some massive structures here. This blade arriving is about 88.8 meters on one of the next generation turbines. So clearly, logistically handling of blades and installation in these environments is a key consideration. And we were quite lucky to have, if you don't recognize this chap, this is the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who visited us about a year ago to review some of the work and test validation we do to de-risk technology, both for static and for floating offshore wind applications. So just to give a bit more of an insight into some of the reports, joint industry reports that we've pulled together, looking at infrastructure development and supply chain. So a lot of these are available for members, but on the website link I've produced, there's a lot of publicly available information as well. So within the sort of focus around infrastructure and supply chain, we kind of touched on that in the previous presentation, but clearly there can be a number of different deployment scenarios for offshore wind in terms of the penetration of floating compared to static. So, you know, understanding that model and incredibly understanding what's required in terms of floating development is going to be quite critical. So assessment of current infrastructure and then supply chain capability to service that infrastructure is pretty fundamental. And then looking at where the gaps are, a kind of SWOT analysis. So the work we did here was basically observed by the Scottish Government, the Crown Estate, which is our kind of home, if you like, and the Crown Estate undertook all the leasing for the various floating zones and fixed zones around Scotland. But we also worked with the Welsh Government and jointly delivered this in partnership with ARAP, looking at a range of different investment models and infrastructure supply chain models for development. And you can see the same picture actually from the previous presenter in terms of what a port would look like in terms of scale and development. think in terms of some of the key technology aspects, which I guess is our bread and butter here at the Catapult, we have focused a large project looking at dynamic cabling system and mooring design. So really understanding the design requirements for some of the subsea cabling that might be used for these environments. I would say that the interaction is probably a lot more harsh than oil and gas in terms of that you have multiple inter-array cables in the wind farm and then generally a large export cable. And that can be subject to extreme fatigue loads on various cycles based on met-ocean conditions. So the kind of wave and tidal conditions, but also the wind loading regimes. So it's important when you design the cable and the interconnector, you look at a whole systems approach. So kind of this report basically looks at a state-of-the-art review, looking at the design requirements for a lot of these cables and looking at some of the projections going forwards in terms of what's required, what the kind of protection mechanisms and cable protection systems would be, what the mooring and anchoring design would have to look like for a range of different offshore geological infrastructure, and really where technology investment needs to be to upscale a lot of this capability. So it's a huge economic opportunity, but also a huge technical challenge. So we delivered this in conjunction with Heritage International and FMS, as you can see. So that's to give a bit of a flavour of some of the reports. Just to analyse that in a bit more detail, because we love techie diagrams here at the Catapult. What we've looked at is coupling essentially mechanical and thermal models. So this is obviously your floating turbine. Then you have a kind of riser, and this is an Orcaflex model showing where you may get environmental forces or stresses on the cable. And then clearly, you know, the cable has some insulation around it. It has 3 cores, and then you need to generate a dynamic model looking at stresses, both in terms of the mechanical load, but also the heat generated leading to hotspots and thermomechanical stress. So this basically outlines where you may get damage under accelerated conditions. And this leads to what we call insulation breakdown and water tree growth. So basically the water gets through the insulation into the core and short circuits the cable. Now, you know, why is that important? Well, if any cables, export cables or dynamic cables go out, you could be talking losses in the orders of millions of lost revenue generation. And then basically a subsea company has to go out, lift the cable up and then reinstate the cable using either wet mate or dry mate connectors. And that operation is constrained by weather windows often in terms of when it can be undertaken, and also clearly capacity of someone to support that. So we've seen in fixed offshore wind around the UK, the highest insurance risk currently is for cable failure related to cable power systems. So clearly one of the key technology aspects is, well, how do we prevent that? How do we design that out? You know, you don't want to be spending £2 billion on an asset that doesn't generate any power essentially. So really it's the Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence looks at a number of these challenges, both technical and supply chain development, and tries to form the best solution going forwards. In terms of the final slide I had, and this is publicly available, so we've looked at various solutions or various options, I guess, to get subsidy free in terms of floating offshore wind. Currently, the cost of floating offshore wind is, as you can see, well, you might not be able to see in this graph, but is estimated the latest strike price of being over 120 to 140 pounds per megawatt hour. And really what we want to be doing is driving down that cost. So clearly it's a higher cost at the moment than fixed, simply because there isn't that much floating offshore wind. But looking at different penetration scenarios, we can see the rates of cost reduction in this estimation, which drop off to 2040. So basically you're getting a technology that's on parity with base load generation in the country. So really looking at cost reduction is going to be driven by deployment levels. Clearly, as you upscale and move to serial production, more and more, you get scales of efficiency, reduction in cost, but also the challenges I mentioned in terms of using larger turbines with floating structures. How do you scale up and get more deployment from the ports? How do you prevent some of the key components, which are the risk factors, such as the moorings or the cabling, having additional fatigue damage in these extreme offshore environments? So it's important that we can service those or design that out. So really, it's kind of dealing with all of these challenges over the next decade or so. But I think we'll get there. I think we're seeing significant investment in floating offshore wind, and it's really going to lead to a rapid reduction in cost. But clearly, there's a technical emphasis associated to achieve that. So this report we've done again, presented the outcomes to UK government, Scottish government, the Crown Estate and Welsh government. So please go and have a look at that if you want to look at anything in more detail, or drop me a line, and we have the Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence website. So that's the end of my short overview. I hope that was useful. Happy to take any questions over the next 5 minutes or so.
Thank you, James. I see Max has his hand raised.
Hi, James. Thank you very much for that presentation. Super interesting. I noticed on one of your 4 programs in the development and consent pillar, there was a box about environmental interactions program. I don't think it's completed or I can't remember what the color represented, but it was a dark blue. But I was wondering if in your research and modeling, you had been able to identify the kind of extent and significance of the impact on benthic habitats from anchoring and cable scoring, and the potential for secondary entanglement associated with fishing gear. Those are 2 primary concerns here in the United States about the potential for floating wind. And would be great to know what your modeling suggests those impacts might be, as well as others like EM fields distributing, certain sea life. But to the extent that you have any insights or projected timelines for when you might cover those, I'd be super keen to know.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been a lot of work done by CFAS in the UK who are more solely focused on environmental issues, and there's been a lot of joint studies with the Crown Estate in the UK. So clearly, I think there's over 11 gigawatts of fixed, which around the UK operating and spinning at the moment. So in terms of the environmental concerns, there's been various reports produced already that deal with issues around how would you affect, the kind of ecology by interfering or basically installing foundations on the seabed, be it monopile or jacket-based structures. So I could kind of refer you to some of those initial reports. And I think in terms of the floating, clearly there's a potential for slightly more interference with the amount of mooring in slightly deeper sites. Also the impact on the kind of ethnic ecology, like you were saying. So we're kind of working on commissioning a range of environmental experts to analyze, well, is that the case with different technologies, and can we look in a lab environment in terms of, are we seeing a significant degradation or not, and what's the best available technology to prevent that in terms of interfering with the environment, both in terms of consenting and deployment issues. So yeah, certainly there's a lot of work ongoing in that respect, and I think the fact that the Scotland auctions identified as the 25 gigawatts, 14 to be floating, those are challenges that can be overcome. So I'm quite happy to send you some previous reports or reference information on that respect.
Spectacular. Thanks, James.
Selena?
Hi, Selena Cunningham from the state of Maine. Thanks for the presentation. It was really helpful. I'm just curious about, in terms of mooring designs and anchoring, how much differentiation do you anticipate seeing in, say, for instance, ScotWind? I mean, those projects, where is the industry going? Are we going to see consistency across these projects or different types of designs in terms of mooring and anchoring?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think longer term we're probably going to see more standardization. At the moment, there's a lot of different companies coming forwards with different designs in terms of the kind of rock piling or different kind of interconnection mechanisms between the anchoring and the cabling to reduce the fatigue. So I think certainly what you're going to see in terms of the Scotland auctions that come forward, I think you're going to see quite a few different designs and different solutions. Clearly, you know, the developers are concerned about the performance in terms of security and reducing risk. So I think then you'll begin to see a bit of commonality and standardization around performance, like we have done in terms of, I guess, fixed foundation installation and other requirements. So I guess my initial view is that there'll be quite a few different technologies, and then there'll be further standardization and certification that will drive that funnel down to the optimal technology solution.
Thank you.
Great. I think we'll do a quick 5-minute break and be back at 35 for our next speaker. So everyone can just stay on and we'll continue at 35. Okay, I hope everyone is back. Our next speaker is Lorna Finlayson from the Scottish Government.
Hi everyone, thanks very much. Bettina, are you okay to share the slides?
Yes, just share them. You just let me know when to change the slides.
Great. So as Bettina mentioned, I'm Lorna Finlayson, Head of Offshore Wind Policy for the Scottish Government. So move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to start off with a bit of an update on the offshore wind policy context in Scotland. The Scottish Government has made offshore wind very central to decarbonising Scotland's energy demand and also achieving our challenging net zero targets by 2045. We've got a clear pipeline of projects throughout this decade and also a significant pipeline of projects coming through from the ScotWind offshore wind leasing round, which I'm sure has been talked quite a lot about this afternoon. With this, oh sorry, I'm still in the first slide there, still another one, sorry. ScotWind has huge economic opportunities for Scotland for building our domestic supply chain, providing opportunities for skills diversification and transferability from the oil and gas sector, as well as creating thousands of new high quality green jobs. So it's very, very, very important. A couple of key policies to mention here are the the offshore wind policy statement and also our sectoral marine plan. They were both published in 2020. The offshore wind policy statement was, as I say, published a couple of years ago, and it includes the ambition for 8 to 11 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. The government in the UK published its 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution also in 2020, and that included a target of 40 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity for the whole of the UK by 2030, and included a 1 gigawatt target for floating offshore wind. It is just really worth noting at this point that we are expecting the Prime Minister of the UK to publish a new energy security strategy, most likely next week, which will set out how the UK reduces its reliance on Russian oil and gas and significantly expand domestic renewables capacity. And as the Scottish Government, we're looking at how we can accelerate renewables as well, including offshore wind, of course. And as many of the energy policy levers are reserved to the UK Government, we have identified a number of areas where we would like the UK Government to go further. And finally, just on the policy context, we're going to be publishing our energy strategy refresh later this year. That's going to take a whole system view of energy, and it's going to take account of the major policy and sectoral developments that have happened since the last time it was published, it was 2017, and things, including things like the outcome of the ScotWind leasing round. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Thank you. So just ScotWind, first of all, I'm sure it's been talked about a lot so far in this session, so apologies if I'm repeating anything here, so I'll just whiz through this. But ScotWind is the first evolved leasing round for offshore wind in Scottish waters, and the first leasing round in a decade in Scotland. There were 17 successful bids out of 74 applications, so a huge amount of interest, which just shows the level of ambition from the market there. And the combined ambition of ScotWind projects is 25 gigawatts. I just heard that been talked about just a moment ago. If that was approved, that would deliver far in excess of our current planning assumption of 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, which was included in our sectoral marine plan. And I'm sure Drew Milne mentioned that earlier. So there are difficult planning consenting processes that will lie ahead. There'll be challenges there, but we are very focused on maximising the opportunities from ScotWind for energy, for the environment, for the economy, and really importantly for our supply chain as well. But we want to do that in a way that aligns with our marine planning framework. And of course, 11 of the 17 projects have said that they use floating technology. and that's with a combined ambition of 15 gigawatts of generating capacity. That makes it the largest scale floating offshore wind opportunity in the world. Just moving on to the next slide. I just wanted to just give a very brief overview of our current pipeline here in Scotland, as well as what's coming through. So this map just shows the projects that we have already that are operational, under construction and consented, and what's coming through in the Scotland leasing round. So we've got just under 1 gigawatt of operational offshore wind and a further 7 gigawatts consented or in construction. Really worthwhile noting that Scotland's home to the world's first floating offshore wind farm, Hywind Scotland, and also the largest floating offshore wind farm, that's Kincardine offshore wind project. And the table just to the right there of the map, you can see an overview of the winning ScotWind bids with the floating offshore wind projects highlighted in green. And we will move on to the next slide. So, as I mentioned, ScotWind's a huge opportunity for renewables capacity, but also it provides a huge economic opportunity. From ScotWind, there'll be 700 million will be generated in option fees, and that will go into the Scottish public purse for public spending. And we have said that we'll use that money and that revenue to tackle the twin crises of climate change and loss of biodiversity. And there's going to be billions more in rental fees when the projects are operational. Developers have committed to invest an average of 1 billion in the Scottish supply chain for every 1 gigawatt of capacity generated. And that's something that we hugely welcome. And that was submitted as part of developer supply chain development statements as part of the leasing round process. So I'm just going to talk a wee bit more about that in the next slide. Thank you. So in the supply chain development statements, the developers were required to outline their committed spend and ambition spend for Scotland over the development and construction of their projects in the first 6 years of operations. The SCDS were not scored as part of the leasing round to ensure compliance with procurement and in regulations, but they will be made public when lease options are signed in April. And any decrease in the project's commitments will need to be justified by the project. And ultimately, developers will face financial penalties if they don't deliver on these commitments. In the most egregious cases, it would be where projects fail to deliver less than 75% of the commitments, then we can actually withdraw the seabed lease via Crown Estate Scotland. So that's an action that could be taken. It's really key that we hold the developers to account on their ambitions and commitments. And just move on to the next slide. So this slide just sets out here just that commitment. So as mentioned before, there's a commitment to invest 25 billion, a combined commitment to invest 25 billion in the Scottish supply chain across all the projects, which, as I said, works out to be about $1 billion per gigawatt. And you can see here as well, it sets out the commitments for spend elsewhere in the UK, in the EU. And also, we asked, as part of the supply chain development statements, we asked the projects to outline their ambition. So where projects might seek to have further investments. And that will be relying on further opportunities coming to light. For example, opportunities for manufacturing components and establishing bases in Scotland. So there's an extra 11.1 billion of commitments there for Scotland in that ambition level. And if we move on to the next slide, thank you. Just very, very briefly, I just wanted to touch on INTOG, the Innovation in Targeted Oil and Gas Offshore Leasing Round. I won't go into too much detail on this at all, but it was just to mention it's another offshore wind leasing round that is going live this year in Scotland. This leasing round will enable innovation projects of up to 100 megawatts to test new technology or solutions in Scottish waters, and secondly, targeted oil and gas projects of up to 500 megawatts. And that will be for specifically delivering green energy to oil and gas installations and helping to decarbonise the oil and gas sector. And INTOG will be targeting 4.5 gigawatts of generating capacity. And the vast majority of that will come, if not all, will come from floating offshore wind technology and will be delivered by the end of this decade. So just thought important to mention that as another part of our pipeline this decade. If we just move on to the last slide. Finally, I just wanted to touch on the role of the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council. This has been identified as a key vehicle by industry and government for taking forward the strategic supply chain opportunities that emerge from the Scotland leasing round. And a key role for SOEC is the implementation of the strategic investment assessment for Scottish offshore wind. It was commissioned by SOEC and led by Professor Sir Jim MacDonald of Strathclyde University. And the main focus of that report and the recommendations was around creating a Scottish floating offshore wind port cluster. And getting ports to work together and developers to work together. And a key mechanism for that is the development of the collaborative framework, which will encourage all developers, the public sector, the ports and the supply chain to work together to maximise the deployment of projects, maximise the supply chain opportunities and mitigate any bottlenecks or delays to projects. And we're planning to launch that collaborative framework agreement in April, when it's finalised and as developers sign their ScotWind option agreements. Okay, and it's me, I'm just on to my last slide. I just wanted to finish there and just open up for any questions on any of that. Sorry, apologies, I know I've just thrown a lot of information at you there.
Thank you, Lorna. Any questions? Yes, Liz?
There, good morning. So I work in the state legislature and I'm just wondering, did you guys do this as like an agency underpinning for guidelines for developers, or did you have to do specific legislation or policy that moved through your government? I'm just curious how you kind of set the floor with developers, or if that just came about kind of doing your due diligence and developer contracts. Thank you.
Yes, there was no specific legislation, but the development of the supply chain development statement was very much done in consultation with the Parliament, the Scottish Parliament. There was obviously a real need, I think, from politicians across the piece that wanted to see the supply chain as the main focus for offshore wind. And try to ensure that that was built into the leasing round, because to be quite frank, it's an area that Scotland hadn't done as well as in recent years, and ministers were very keen to ensure that the supply chain was the main focus, that the leasing round was built on quality and deliverability and supply chain maximisation. So yes, there's no specific legislation in those terms, but that was very much built into the Crown Estate Scotland, who run and administer the leasing round. That was built into their process and the contracts there. So the supply chain development statement would be required to be submitted by every developer, but it wasn't scored. As I said, as part of the licensing round, that wasn't actually scored because that would have been in a breach of competition law. But yes, it was part of the leasing round that had to be submitted, which obviously then, with them being made public every 3 years, there's obviously a level of public accountability that people were asked to honour those commitments, and there'd be financial penalties if they didn't do it.
And with that, if I can do a follow-up, did you guys also do any kind of like wildlife mitigation at that stage? Because like what we heard in the US when I went back to DC to talk about it was that specifically on the East Coast, they have the right whales. On the West Coast, we have a number of native megafauna that we really want to make sure we're not interfering with. Was that part of this policy development point, or was that something that was done with outside consultation?
Yes, it was part of the sectoral marine plan that Drew might have mentioned earlier on in his presentation. So yes, that was part of that, and there's a consultation with all stakeholders and different marine users, third sector, etc. So those issues would have been dealt with in the sectoral marine plan. So the two things were published together: the sectoral marine plan and the offshore wind policy statement, to bring those two together.
Thank you, Lorna. Any other questions? No. Thank you so much, Lorna. Our next speaker is Jan Mattison from Carbon Trust.
Yeah, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Do you want me to share my slides?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yes. 1 second. Can you see them now?
We see them. It's in presenter mode, though.
Let me just swap this.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. Excellent. Well, yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay and see my slides. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to join this roundtable today. My name is Jan Mattison, and I'm a director at the Carbon Trust, a consultancy company from the UK. And over the next 20 minutes, I would like to talk to you about how to accelerate offshore wind technology and also policy development. Good. Let me start by giving you a brief update, a brief introduction to the Carbon Trust. Just 1 second. The Carbon Trust, we are a consultancy company. We are based in the UK, the headquarters in London, and we also have an office in Edinburgh. But you can see that we have a range of offices in different countries, on 5 different continents, actually. In total, we are now 380 people, just over, growing actually quite fast. And we are working in 3 different areas. We are providing advice to government and to industry around carbon footprinting, setting standards, and we are also doing R&D on the low carbon technology to accelerate the commercialization of low carbon technology. Just go to the next slide briefly. Yeah, so we aim to do looking at offshore wind in more more detail. Sorry, I'm struggling with my screen here a little bit. Yeah, looking at offshore wind in more detail. We are accelerating the move to net zero, and we believe that offshore wind has a critical role in this ambition and plays a critical role in this. So therefore, we are working with government and with industry to reduce the cost of offshore wind, but also help to scale up offshore wind. And in doing this, we are in a way unique to many other organizations. We are a mission-driven organization. That means we measure our success on the impact that we achieve. We are also cross-disciplinary. So we have a range of expertise in the organization, such as energy systems. We have a green finance team, technology incubation, and also policy advice. And as I will show you in a minute, we think that collaboration is critical in accelerating the move to low carbon economy and also to scale up offshore wind. And we have 12 years track record in doing such collaboration activities. And then finally, we are also independent partner. We sit in between industry and public sector. Originally, we have been actually created by UK government to help industry meet low carbon targets. But that's enough about the Carbon Trust. Let me start by explaining a little bit how I see policy and technology can be accelerated. And maybe I start by sort of looking at what policy I consider as important. And I want to focus on four different areas. The first one is markets. And what do I mean with markets here? I'm referring really to the development of the right market conditions for offshore wind, to facilitate and to create an industry. And for this, it is important that you have to set the right ambitions, the right targets, to create a long-term vision on how government sees the growth of offshore wind happening, but also to have long-term visibility of auction rounds that helps, and to consider how offshore wind fits into the wider energy policy. The role of offshore wind into the wider energy mix is quite important. And you need the right incentives which need to be suitable for the maturity of the market. And this will then lead to more certainty about the likely market, and that will create opportunities for investment. It will reduce risk. It drives investment into innovations, and then ultimately will create an offshore wind market. So the next area that I want to highlight, the next challenge in a way, is the supply chain. And preferably, you would have a domestic supply chain, but during the early years of a market development, it may require imports that from other markets. But creating regional clusters, providing support for port developments, that can all help to attract more local suppliers, local content. And developing the skills, the workforce to build wind farms is also very important going along. And again, government can help establishing this, providing support to drive innovations in R&D, and this will help the supply chain to be more competitive. And then this will lead to a scale up of the supply chain, which will increase efficiency and reducing the cost. And ultimately, it will create local domestic economic benefits. The third area I wanted to highlight is all around energy integration. It's around the grid, and having long-term grid planning and adopting the grid for the renewable energy generation technology. That's very important here. However, it's not only the grid. Governments should take a much wider energy system perspective, considering how offshore wind will integrate into the wider energy system and support the energy transition. And that will also need to include hydrogen or maybe other low carbon fuels, for example. And ultimately, this will then increase the confidence of investments, provide opportunities also for new business cases, such as generation of hydrogen. And finally, it will lead to a sustainable, and what's increasingly important nowadays, also a secure low carbon energy system. The last area that I want to highlight here on this slide is around spatial planning. Where do you place the wind farms? And here, having clear and predictable planning regulations is important. Having a consenting and licensing process that is supported by clear policies that will help to reduce risk and provide certainty, but also having a clear guidelines and policy around stakeholder engagement will help to ensure that every view and opinion is heard and considered. And then having marine spatial planning policies that ensure that wind energy is located really at the most suitable location, taking into account other users, but also the environment. And then this will really lead to more regulatory certainty, and more clarity of future potential, but also harmony of ocean users, and ultimately to a sustainable and long-lasting offshore wind industry in the country. So you can see from the slides of which policy I would consider important in creating an offshore wind industry. But in order to accelerate the policies in these 4 different areas, we think that on one side, collaboration is critical, and you probably heard this already from some other speakers today. And that is collaboration not only among industry, but also collaboration between governments, regulators, or maybe other policy stakeholders. And the other area that is important is to learn from markets that have established offshore wind industry. And we have done many mistakes. We have learned many lessons here in Europe. So there are opportunities to take them and to learn from this, which is obviously the reason why we have this roundtable. So over the next slides, I would like to give you some examples of first about collaboration, and then highlight how we provided some lessons that we have learned here in Europe to some other markets. And let me start with collaboration. Sorry. We are running in the Carbon Trust, we are running a number of collaborative R&D programs. And these are collaborations between offshore wind farm developers, but also government or government agencies. And you can see the logos on the slide here. Our flagship program is the OWA, the Offshore Wind Accelerator, that aims to reduce the cost of offshore wind for fixed bottom installation. But we also set up a specific program for floating offshore wind, which aims to make a floating wind fully commercial. The ORTIP program looks specifically at reducing the consenting risk of offshore wind, the licensing, the environmental risk. And the last program is the integrator that aims, as the name says already, to maximize the integration of offshore wind into the energy system. In creating a sort of common understanding of challenges that need to be addressed, sharing knowledge, sharing learnings, and risk and cost also for projects, that all helps to accelerate new technology. Let me go into one of these joint industry programs in a little bit more detail, and that is the floating wind program. We set this program up in 2016 with support actually from Scottish government, with the aim to commercialize floating wind, moving from the pre-commercial projects that we are seeing in the moment in the water to fully commercial large-scale floating wind projects. And in order to do this, certain barriers need to be overcome, and we are focusing on electrical systems, mooring systems, logistics, turbine and foundation optimization, and also asset integrity. And the program is working with 17 industry partners, you can see here, also including Japanese developers like TEPCO. So it's a very international program. It's market agnostic and addresses really the key technology challenges to commercialize floating wind fully. over the last 10 years or so, we have increasingly focused on providing lessons learned from Europe to other new emerging offshore wind markets. Because if we want to really accelerate the scale up of offshore wind, we need to learn from what has been done already. I would like to give you some examples how we aim to, or we contributed to this process, how we provided some of the lessons that we have learned. As I highlighted earlier, understanding supply chain gaps is important. Understanding what the supply chain can offer and what gaps needs to be filled to maximize the domestic benefit is critical. So we have done a study, for example, in Ireland to help identify opportunities in the supply chain for Ireland. Similar, attracting inwards investments is important. So we provided a recommendation to the Welsh government on how to improve attractiveness of offshore wind for the local market. Aspects like investment in ports, developing industry clusters and supporting business with skills development have been highlighted in this study. And then also in collaboration between the Japanese and the UK government, we undertook an analysis on how policy has impacted the innovation process. And that is important to understand when looking at cost reduction and also designing policy around innovations. Looking a little bit into the Asian market, as I explained earlier, collaboration can be very beneficial. So especially for new markets. So we provided some learnings on how collaboration between public and private sector helped develop the offshore wind industry. And we have done this for a number of markets. More specifically, in Japan and in China, we have provided advice on policies and supply chain development. Then looking at America, we have worked with Colombian government, but also US government to exchange information on offshore wind market development. There's been a range of webinars that have been supported also by UK government. And finally, we are participating in NOW-IDC, a collaborative R&D consortium in the US that aims to reduce cost of offshore wind. So you can see all our activities are aiming to really help accelerate the development of offshore wind by either establishing collaboration, working together, or share lessons that we have learned in Europe. So I'm nearly at the end of my presentation, but I just want to give you some brief recommendation from my side for you to take away. And that is really to create a strong domestic market by really creating confidence in the market. I think that is really critical. Invest in key enabling infrastructure, ports, manufacturing facilities, support innovations in the supply chain. Ongoing technology development is critical. Prepare the supply chain for future needs and requirements, but also increase coordination of supply chain by allowing knowledge and skills transfers across different industry sectors. That helps. And finally, align decarbonization and energy goals with industrial strategy and recovery. The renewable energy sector, I think it provides huge amounts of opportunities for industries that have been hit very hard by COVID pandemic. So there are real opportunities to help them from the growing renewable energy sector. So I hope you found this this helpful, and they are happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Any questions for Jan?
Hi, Bettina. It's Stephanie Watson on the phone from Maine. Thank you, Jan. As always, really great presentation and information. I was wondering, have you been looking at all at how lowering the costs and what the costs are to ratepayers in different places that are deploying offshore wind. I mean, it is a challenge for many of us, I think, to think through how, we're supporting this industry, this important renewable energy industry, important to decarbonize, but what else do we need to do or think about in terms of making sure that all of these costs are not passed on to our ratepayers?
It's a good point, Stephanie. And we have done a sort of a relatively high level cost analysis, but not in enough breakdown to look at the impact of sort of the ratepayers as such. That may be something to consider in the future, but we haven't done this in enough detail to provide sort of insights into this sufficiently.
Great. If there's no more questions, we'll move on to our next speaker. Thank you again, Jan. Our next speaker and final speaker today is Malcolm Morrison from Scottish Fishermen's Federation. Hello, Malcolm.
Hi there. It's been very good so far. Let's see what happens now. Okay. Good evening, people, or afternoon where you are. Fishing industry has been feeding the world for thousands of years, and nowadays we are aiming for coexistence, working with all the other people that work in the marine environment. So these are the members of our federation. Whoops. It's formed in 1973, basically when the EU instituted the common fisheries policy. The fishermen at the time realized they needed some protection from that, so they all got together, and ever since then they've continued to support a federation, and 2 or 3 of us are employed just to protect their rights. The next, please. So just as a scene setter, there are 4,737 guys at sea. And the important bit then is there are 5 jobs ashore for every one of them. So you're looking at 30,000, 40,000 people working in fishing. At the moment, we've got 2,088 vessels, but you see the under 10s are the biggest number. That's a smaller class of boats. The over 10s, that is a third of what the fleet was at the start of the century, because the fabled overfishing and fisheries management, we've managed to come back to a stage where fishing is a sustainable industry at this level. And then you see we've got nearly 400,000 tons of fish and shellfish landed in Scotland. It's a lot of feeding. We are one of the lowest carbon producers of the food industry, and everybody knows the value of eating the likes of mackerel, oily fish, nephrops, the little langoustines, haddocks. We've some major ports in the UK. The Fraserburgh is the #1 in the UK for shellfish. Peterhead is the #1 in Europe for whitefish. And Peterhead and Lerwick share the pelagic. But Lerwick, despite being the 3rd in the ranks in Scotland, still lands more fish than the whole of England and Wales. So that gives you a kind of feel for the value of fishing to the Scottish economy. Next, please. So here we have the sort of extent of our membership. We've got guys who'll go to sea single-handedly, and then we've got guys who, well, that boat will take about 10 people. We'll fish for 8 weeks of the year. Total machine. It catches, but then it's a very dangerous job. So when they go to sea, they're out there, and yeah, it's always at the back of their minds. Just the boat's big enough, but I mean, I've seen boats that size where a wave rolled over it and burst through the wheelhouse windows, which up top there. So it's a very, very dangerous game. Next, please. So you see here, there are basically 7 different types of fishing, really, which is kind of problematic when you're speaking to people ashore, because they just think fishing's fishing. But every one of these types of fishing is sort of specific to certain species, which means they're specific to certain grounds. And the boats are built specifically for that. So it's a very well developed industry in that respect, because these guys know what they're doing. They go out and fish, and all of them, most of them in Scotland, are family owned. I'm not sure how it goes across the Atlantic, but we're still a family owned economy. Next, please. So we recognize that we're not the only people who want to work in the marine environment. We've worked with oil and gas for over 40 years. We've got a very good relationship with them. I don't know, it's maybe just because oil is oil and they're quite happy to bend over backwards for everybody, but it works. Marine renewables, we've only had marine renewables in Scotland for just over 10 years. Subsea cables, yeah, at the moment that's still regulated by an Act of Parliament from 1855, so it's kind of outdated. It's just not fit for purpose. And then the modern day paradigm, we have the conservation sites, and Scotland especially, we've got marine protected areas, and we have a commitment from the government of 10% of highly protected areas. So that's it's a big deal. I guess we're almost leading the world in that. Aquaculture, you know that salmon is almost the #1 export from Scotland, apart from that brown liquid that people drink. Shellfish, that's a huge deal. Langoustines, clams, everything. And seaweed. The particular problem with seaweed is that they're going to need huge swathes of the sea to build their platforms to do that. So we really will have to bring them into the marine planning area. Tourism and recreation, it's probably not as big in this country as it is in others, but there are people who make a good living on the West Coast, guaranteeing people if you go for a boat trip with them, you'll see whales and dolphins and porpoises, etc. Other maritime traffic, there's plenty of different types of activity going on with other boats in the area. And then you have dredging and mineral extraction, which we don't have an awful lot of in Scotland, but it's there. So there's all these different people needing to have access to the sea. So yeah, I mean, we're aiming for coexistence, but the question really is, we must coexist. So that's all we're looking for. I mean, in general terms, whenever we speak with renewables industry, we tell them, explain, we're not against renewables. We just need to be considered. Next, please. So you've seen this slide a few times today. So, 17 brand new ones. Oh, yeah, 17 brand new ones in Scotland. The half dozen that were in before are just about ready. So you can see there's a fair scope of seabed on the east coast that will be lost to fishing. The original tower turbines, there is still a hope that people can fish in between the turbines, especially once the distances get bigger. At the moment, we're at 1.2 kilometers, and some fishing can happen with that if the cables are buried. But at the moment, we see floating offshore as being completely closed to us. It's not going to be safe. It's not going to be possible to fish in there. So that brings its own set of problems, because most of these 17 Scotland projects will be floaters. So as you can see there. So next, please. So this is how things have started. The 6 we got in the first round, round 3 of the UK, just over 10 years ago. I'm not sure if everybody's aware of the fact that the Crown Estate owns the seabed. They have the rights to it, and then they lease that. But in 2010, unfortunately, the Crown Estate, based in London, just gave 6 leases to renewables companies to build in Scotland without any consideration of fishing. And that has meant that instead of spending my life talking about fish to fishermen and politicians, have ended up spending a lot of time talking with wind farm developers. And it's incredible the difference between people. It is all down to people, and we try to make sure there's communication and collaboration in order to try and achieve coexistence, but it's really difficult. I mean, we're well aware of the climate crisis, but the licensing and consenting process at sea is not transparent enough, and it doesn't have any teeth. It's got no great powers. I mean, if you were to stick a wind farm in the middle of a city and it was a foot out of place, the planning law would tell you you had to shift it. But at sea, they apply for a variation and it gets done. So it's controversial with people, because there is no way of knowing where the dividing line is, which of the industries in the area are going to want to use. So, as you heard in the very first presentation, Drew, we spent 2 years with Drew gathering fishing data from all our members, and we tried to help with the evidence map to the extent that we labeled each and every one of the potential plan options 1 to 5, as in 1 where we would support and 5 where we'd completely oppose. So we've done all we could then, and we thought we're doing well. The Crown Estate agreed that they would only lease according to that plan, but still licensing and consenting needs to be much more transparent. We put in all our data, and then the licensing people advise the government, or advise the minister on what's to be done, and nobody knows what that advice is. So it's kind of not the best practice. Despite that, the plan itself reads very well. It's a very good plan. It just doesn't. It says all the right things. The Scottish National Marine Plan and the renewables plan. But it's just a matter of getting it all into reality. Next, please. So for the first few months of this year, we're basically hanging around waiting for ScotWind leases to be negotiated, agreed, signed, and that includes all the talk you've heard about. There's promise to use Scottish labour, Scottish goods, etc. So that should be out by April, and then we'll be starting looking at the discussions as they work out their developments. We will be sort of responding to the environmental impact assessments and trying to make sure that it's understood where we operate. And it is just quite sensibly, if it's not going to impact on fishing, we have no problem with it. But if it's going to impact on fishing, we really do have to step up and protect our guys. The turbine layout is part of it, but the biggest thing is really cable routes. When you've got the inter-array cable routes, that would stop fishing within the farm, and then the export cables are really quite a difficult thing, because by the time you get inshore, that's where you get all the smaller boats, one-man operations working, so it gets very difficult to get in about them. So this round, ScotWind, they expect to start work offshore in 2026, by which time I hope to be sitting on a beach in the south of France. They'll go on for 50 years this time round, and I guess the original ones will also end up being 50 years, but we'll see what happens. So ScotWind, as you've heard, had been advertised as 10 gigawatts, but they assure us that the jump to 24 gigawatts is not any extra infrastructure. It is just because of technological creep, where the turbines have grown significantly over the course of the process. Next, please. So here you go. This is everything. You've got yellow, you've got the licensed wind farms. Purple, I guess, is the areas of search which have come in for ScotWind, with MPAs, all the protected areas, and then oil and gas. So you can see that, although it's out of kilter with reality and a little in the scale, but you can see that there are many areas where we cannot fish. And that's even before you consider that we don't fish in 100% of the sea anyway. So it is a matter of living and sharing and trying to work together. So we've managed so far, but there's a big expectation on the renewables industry that they will think about us. Scotland's National Marine Plan does use the phrase consider fishing. So there we go. Next. So the first round that came up 10 years ago, all the license applications said fishing may continue post-construction. There's nobody ever proved it yet, but the regulators have accepted that, and the only recourse for us will be in retrospect if we can prove that people have lost their livelihoods out of it. Yeah, you've heard from Catapult, Carbon Trust, etc. There's hundreds of projects trying to prove coexistence. But if we were really going to do a good job, we would be doing proper holistic planning for the marine environment, which makes sure everybody has a place and everybody carries on, because we firmly believe that if we manage to solve the climate crisis and humanity carries on increasing on the planet, the next thing will be the protein crisis. And that's basically a matter of food security, because if you don't have your own, like a couple of months' time, nobody's going to have a loaf of bread, because a third of the world's wheat is in a war zone. So you need to look after your indigenous industries just to make sure of these things. And then coexistence, for our industry, coexistence means we can operate in the same manner before the construction and after it. So that's our interpretation of it. I don't think it's shared exactly by the renewables, but when they started coming to Scotland, we were quite keen to work with them, and we always said that compensation was the last resort. But experience tells me now that when I read the RODA paper on impacts, that's got to be proactive, and that's got to be the way to go, because there's no point in just lying down and getting your tummy tickled. You've got to stand up and look for coexistence. Next, please. So there you go. I've told you those 7 different kinds of fishing. So most of them are either difficult or almost impossible within a wind farm. So you can see that that's got potential for being a big problem if all these people are displaced. So that's part of the whole planning regime that needs to be sorted. Oh, okay, and the next one. So yeah, here you go. It'll be a picture of Peterhead fish market at the top, the biggest white fish market in Europe, as I said, and then a picture of mackerel below. And the CO2 project, we still haven't got a full handle on it, but they have done it on mackerel so far, and mackerel is absolutely the lowest carbon producer of all that food chain there. So yet another good reason to protect fishing. Next, please.
Sorry, there's my computer's freaking out.
Okay.
Yeah, apologies.
Yeah, so we've now started describing it as the spatial squeeze, because you've got so many people wanting to get out into the sea. So we're going to have to start doing much more about it. The colleagues in Holland about 15, 20 years ago did a total survey over their sea area and came to the conclusion that fishing was only allowed to happen in a square inch. So that report will no doubt be somewhere on the web. So we fully accept that, you know, nobody's got a more right than anybody to work out there. But, you know, it's if you've got 1,000 family farms producing low carbon food, any government should be hoping to look after that, just to make sure that it survives. And then, yeah, I mean, fair and equitable marine planning for coexistence. At the moment, when we're talking about coexistence, it's very often just the renewables developer, the fishing in a room. and basically arguing about what we expect and what they expect, but it needs to be much more holistic. So that's what we'll be aiming for with the work we're doing in the spatial squeeze, just to try and get that sort of whole environment, look at it. Yeah, and then achieving coexistence, it must allow all the different sectors to remain viable. Yeah, fishing on a postage stamp, that's equivalent to the fishing on a square mile. It just isn't good, you know. It's not going to allow people to make a living. So these days we keep talking about the just transition. So I kind of hope that by the time Scotland is fully built out, there will have been a just transition. So I hope it's not just a new phrase. And there you go. Fishing is low carbon, high protein, healthy. EHA and DHA and omega-3, and we're part of the route map to net zero. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. I see we already have a question from Drew.
Yes.
Hello, Malcolm. Thank you very much.
Right.
Very, very good overview. And when you see that last map that you put up, it's a very crowded space. I wanted to explore with you processes to support that coexistence. As I'm sure you're aware, in the US, the initial framework is to have a nautical mile separation between fixed foundations on the East Coast. Yeah. I think Rhoda still feels that that's not quite adequate, but that's maybe to be seen when it's actually in place. We're all aware that the scale of the individual turbines is getting bigger very, very rapidly. And as a result, spacing has to be further apart, simply to avoid interaction of the blades as well as the wind turbulence. Floating is a major part of the new ScotWind lease, and certainly the individual machine with its moorings is not conducive to active gear in any form. So I guess really the question is, you know, if there was sufficient spacing between large enough installations to basically create lanes for active gear. As you probably know, here there are informal agreements between fixed and active gear fishermen to avoid conflicts. So the idea of having an established lane is not unusual. But when you look at your map and the requirement to bury the cable seems absolutely crucial. Even in areas that have fairly hard bottom, there are means to try to cover them. So, you know, given the process that's occurred thus far, how can, it's almost really asking the question, what is the metric for the minimal spacing between individual machines? And then how large do they have to be able to meet the energy targets? I mean, that's for the developers and the government to figure out. But from a fishing perspective, depending on the gear usage in different sectors, could there be a minimum spacing established that would allow insurance coverage, allow safe, you know, activity, all the different issues that obviously have come up?
You've just mentioned the elephant in the room, Drew. Insurance. On the other side of the North Sea, there has been a couple of incidences where beamers have caught the cables, and the insurance company has tried to take them to court. So, and that's potentially, a bankruptcy scenario. So would like to avoid that if possible. Yeah, it's something we do keep trying to speak to them, but we've never actually sort of come round to the idea of our people saying to us that they can live with a certain gap, because turbines, they say 1 kilometer's good. Hey, a mile will be fantastic. But then when you go into floating, I mean, right now, the way the technology is, you're going to need, what, 2 kilometers diameter? So every one of them is going to have that. And of course, you're constricted by the blades, your microsighting of the turbines is quite tricky to make sure that it carries on blowing through the whole farm, so that some of them aren't just sitting there idle. So it's difficult. It really is difficult. It's one of these things that they would need, now that there are some actually built, that's when the research would need to be done. Like I say, floating, we almost consider it closed. High Wind is going to do trials this summer, supposed to be. So we'll see what they come up with. I'm not putting any money on it being a success.
Yeah. Do you know how far apart High Wind? That's the one off Aberdeen, correct?
Off Peterhead. Yeah.
Peterhead. Yeah. Yeah.
I think they put them pretty close so that the anchors, weren't too far apart. There is no way you could tow gear through it.
Well, given the enormous challenges of consenting and working through this process, and certainly I entirely agree with your premise that the protein crisis and the climate crisis are inextricably linked, and that a sustainable fishery, which Scotland has finally achieved in certain sectors, is a super important goal. That as you know, there are multiple floating, unlike the fixed foundations where there's a couple of different types, but basically they're very, very similar. In the floating technology, there are many, many different proposed technologies. No one has risen to the surface, so to speak. But if the challenge was put, whether it's to ORE Catapult or wherever else, to design an effective floating wind structure, which did not require such a wide footprint of mooring, and was designed to enhance access to fishing in between, was perhaps built to a scale that meant the power offtake could support a 1.5 nautical mile distance, whatever is optimum. Then you're basically selecting from technology options to favor those that are less conflicting, but still have engineering design. And for me, that's really fundamentally an engineering problem. Once you've defined the on your side, and I know it's tough to get each sector to accept any kind of constraint, but if it's going to be built anyway and you're feeling like you're shut out, if there was a challenge put out there to enable this kind of passage, then you have the combination of access but also effectively some areas where fish are going to have some reserve, particularly for juvenile fish. There'll be sections within the area that aren't fishable, and other sections that are, and just from a sustainability perspective, having those enhanced areas for juvenile recruitment, and then corridors where the adults, if they venture in, can be captured, whether they're nephrops or haddock or whatever they are. That just seems like something to pursue, rather than the notion that it must come down to compensation, because compensation does not solve the protein crisis. It's a dead end from a sustainability perspective.
Yeah, but I'm not an engineer, but I do think very fondly of tension leg platforms.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assured technology does exist in the oil and gas industry. So that would just be the diameter of your mooring, straight up and down. But there's huge. I think the problem is the electrical cable wouldn't be quite as.
It still comes down to the cabling, because if you space them an extra half mile apart, you've just added the cost on top of it. So if you put the spacing wider apart, one of the benefits of the 1 nautical mile spacing is, again, every half mile of cable is that much cost goes on to it, along with all the associated, even if the turbines get larger. Again, the electrical in Scotland, it's different, because at some point Scotland's going to actually exceed its needs, meaning that its electrical generation from offshore wind.
Oh yeah.
Here in the United States, our offshore wind is basically backfilling other more carbon intensive generation. But to your point, the dynamics of the type of floating wind technology, whether it could be, how would you say it, given preference to a tension leg design over a float, the more the semi-submersible, because of the lack of the mooring, which is dropping down wider. Those are all trade-offs, but unfortunately, there's not an accounting for that in the award of the leases. And so that is
a little bit of that, because the two floaters, there's the one at Peterhead and there's the one at Aberdeen.
Right.
So they are both slightly different. So they do like to say that they're teasing.
Well, but as far as the technical, so I think we should probably move on. This is obviously a very rich area, and I see Stephanie has a hand up. But fundamentally, the Peterhead, original high wind, being that spar type, is going to be the least likely to be built anywhere else in the world because of the port constraints, which we heard earlier from John McCaskill. Whereas you're likely to see the semi-submersible with the wider spread, which is unfortunate, but it does come, the trade-offs are there. So I'll turn it back to Bettina.
I'll just give you a quick word on the aggregation. I mean, we all know there is such a thing as fish aggregation devices, and on paper, turbine towers would serve that. But there's been work done in Belgium where they decided that the possible outcome, once all the smaller macro, micro stuff colonized, eventually you would get things like mussels coming in.
Right.
And the end result was that the seabed around the place became anoxic because of the mussel waste. So that wouldn't encourage too many to come in. So there's a lot going on there that we still have to learn about.
Agreed. Bettina.
Sorry, was somebody else coming in?
Yeah, we have one more question from Stephanie.
Hi, Bettina, do we have time? If not, I'm happy to follow up with Malcolm offline if that would be better. Just let me know.
Whatever's fine. We have 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, Malcolm, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your insight thinking about this for a long time. One thing you mentioned that I was really curious about is your note of unbiased holistic planning for the marine environment. Just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and your vision for what that would be. Thank you.
Sorry, what was the phrase you used for the sick man, was it? Or a plan?
I'm sorry, should I repeat that?
So what was I just missed the first little bit of the question.
Okay, well, you had mentioned something really interesting to me. You mentioned unbiased holistic planning for the marine environment. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more.
I could always stand for a president, but I guess somebody's going to turn around and say he spent his life in the fishing industry, so he'll be biased. But you know, it's one of these things that seems to me to be self-evident. We're in a climate crisis. We could run out of food in the next lifetime. You know, we've still got a third world where people don't have food, they don't have power, etc., etc. So it needs somebody to sit down and just try and make a fair assessment of everything. I mean, people in Scotland are not going to give up their 60-inch TVs. You know, people are very hard pushed to give up cars. But yet there are huge swathes of the world that don't have that. And it's all part of the problem that's being caused. So yeah, I would hope that there are scientists somewhere who will be suitably unbiased and work on these things, but who knows?
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, or just make it more muddy?
But it sounds like a really challenging task, but super important. So it sounds like it's an all hands on deck situation.
Yeah, I guess I'm showing my idealism, but that's why I ran away to sea in the first place. So
Thank you so much, Malcolm. I think we're going to move on. Again, thank you to all the speakers. We really appreciated you taking your time today. I think we'll hear some words from Barry, and then we'll talk about the itinerary for April. Barry?
Yes. Okay. So again, thank you very much to Liz and Stephanie from Business Network of Offshore Wind. I hope everyone found the presentations by our Scottish team to be insightful. I would like to open, obviously they've all made it clear that we are very interested in continuing relationships with the US offshore wind industry. We speak about the Scottish, UK, and European experience. As we each know, experience also means failure. We want to make sure that what we've done overseas allows us to do things better here, a bit smarter, a bit better for everybody. So with that, I'll turn you back over to Bettina. Some of our experts will be, if not themselves, their colleagues will be at the Wind Europe. And certainly in the meantime, feel free to contact Bettina and myself to arrange for any follow-up. So again, thank you all, and enjoy your trip.
So Barry, thank you. This has been great. It's been really, really informative. We appreciate all your hard work. It might not look like it because he made it seem so seamless and wonderful, but it took about 3 months to pull this whole thing together. And it is, we all know that it isn't easy to herd all the cats and bring all this expertise together, and you did it wonderfully. So thank you very much. If everybody could turn on their camera so we can give him a little a round of applause here, please. So we can see all of you, and you can at least see our faces and our appreciation. And we will be I know everybody's anxious to get across the pond and meet your colleagues in person. So thank you again for this. I think it's been really, really wonderful.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. Everyone, you are more than welcome to come to Scotland. And Liz can certainly vouch for it. It's an exciting time. Everything's within a bit, and we would welcome anyone and all to come the next time around. So if you do make a trip over there, either for pleasure or business, feel free to get in touch with me, and I can put you in touch with the right people there. Thank you all. I'm gonna drop off now.
Great,
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Malcolm.